You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? How are you all doing tonight? I'm excited for tonight's episode. As you can see, we have Chris Date and Dr. Tim Stratton with us tonight. We also have my co-host, as always, David Russell. Actually, the two co-hosts, like right there, Joshua Davison, David Russell. Guys, how are you all doing tonight?
Good, bro. Good.
So what is new, David?
Hey,
like, I know we did a episode on Tuesday, and that was fun. We had Dr. David Farnell on, from former professor at the Master Seminary. He is now teaching at Redeemer Bible in Phoenix, Arizona church. And yeah, it was just a fun conversation about inerrancy. And what'd you think? What was your overall takeaway? I know you had some pushback a little bit, but overall, what'd you think of it, David?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Dr. Farnell. I mean, he was a great guy, and you know,
he was funny.
Even when me and him disagreed a little bit, you know, it was gracious, and I wasn't trying to debate or anything. I was just trying to say, hey, look, I don't think this is exactly what's happening, but you know, it was great, man. But yeah, the week has been crazy, man. It's homecoming weekend for my teens, so they're out at the homecoming game and doing their thing tonight. And the wife, you know, she's stressed because she's got to drive them all over the place. So I'm gracious that I was here, and I got to go up to the winery this earlier afternoon to actually rack my Pinot Grigio Viognier.
Oh,
So the wife and me have decided to next dive into a Super Tuscan Red. So that's what's going on with us, and yeah, it's exciting.
I don't know what any of that means, but just send me a bottle of it whenever you get time. Okay?
Yeah, sure will, brother. Sure will. I'll let you know when we can. I'll send you a bottle of port too. We just bottled that last week. So
Sure.
We got the port, which is a dessert wine, and it goes really well with a Black Forest cake, and you'd just be amazed of how it complements and enhances the flavor.
I'm all about dessert wine, so send me it, brother, and I'll let you know how it is. Joshua Davidson, my friend, my brother, what is going on, man? How are you doing this evening?
I'm good. I'm just sorry I hopped in there last minute. I was late coming back from work and didn't have time to change or anything like that, so I'm still wearing my Farmer John's.
There you go. I thought you just rocking
yeah,
the farmer look, bro, like California farmer.
You know, it kind of suits, but it's all right. But yeah, I'm having a good week. It was a very fast week. I didn't come back to California until Tuesday, and I got back to work on Wednesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It was a super quick week for me.
I bet.
Yeah, and you know already I had a fantastic weekend because you were one of the bigger parts of it. So that was really cool. Everybody who doesn't know, I got to meet Tyler in person for the first time, which was a blessing and a half. And this dude is a really tall, a lot taller than I expected guy. And that was really fun. That was cool. And I got to hang out with him and his daughter and his wife and go to a park, and wish I had my daughter with me to run around and do crazy things. But yeah, it was,
I know you were missing the fam, man. Like that.
Oh,
that
dude, your daughter's so cute.
Thank you.
Your daughter is so cute, and it made me want to just have my daughter with me.
Yeah.
Oh man, but I can imagine that they'd be a lively bunch together, and it would be impossible to concentrate on anything else.
Next year we'll have to see that happen whenever you come down. So I'm telling you, man, we're gonna get you down here one way or another, and then we're gonna drive down to Virginia to see David. So it'll be a fun trip for you guys. But anyway, so the two gentlemen of the hour, we'll go ahead and introduce you guys. Chris, we'll start with you, brother. It's been a while since you've been on the episode. How have you been? And for those who don't know you, just give a brief little intro of yourself and what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Great. Well, first of all, I'm very thankful to be here, especially in the company of so many just epic beards. Mine isn't as good as all of yours, but I think it competes a little bit, so that's good. I am most well known for my work with a ministry called Rethinking Hell, where we are conservative evangelicals who've become convinced that the Bible very clearly does not teach the doctrine of eternal torment, but rather teaches conditional immortality or annihilationism. And just as a shameless plug, we're having our 9th annual Rethinking Hell conference 1 week from today. So Friday and Saturday, October 28th and 29th, in Evansville, Indiana, at the church that Braxton Hunter, a friend of all of ours, or many of ours at least, attends. In fact, he's going to be one of the speakers. So if people want to attend in person or virtually online, you can go to rethinkinghellconference.com to get all the details. But obviously, we're not here today to talk about hell. We're here to talk about theological determinism. And if there is a second place issue for which I'm known, second to the topic of hell, it's arguably my belief in 5-point Calvinism and theological determinism. And so I have been on Unbelievable with Justin Brierly, opposite friend and colleague at Trinity named Leighton Flowers, who is a provisionist, and I'm a Calvinist, as I mentioned. And I've done other debates and conversations like these. And, just in a nutshell, I have become convinced that the Bible does indeed teach theological determinism and 5-point Calvinism. And so I'm happy to discuss those issues, but at the same time, I hold to those views with an open hand. I want to believe what's true, not merely what I have come to believe is true. And I have the conviction that the primary way, if not the only way, that we can abandon false beliefs and embrace truer ones is when brothers who disagree come along and we get to sharpen each other's iron. And so I'm looking forward to having that kind of mutually iron sharpening discussion with my friend and colleague at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, Molinist Tim Stratton. So thanks again for inviting us both on the show.
Absolutely, brother. We are glad.
And hold on, Travis, Tyler, hold on. I almost called you Travis again.
You did call me Travis.
I just wanna read this. Says Chris Date, you are my hero. So you know what? My statement's right. You guys are legends. So
that's Tyler Vella, by the way, and it's funny that he calls me his hero because I very much look up to him. And I'll be frank, the vast majority of what you're going to hear from me today in my opening is largely influenced by discussions I've recently watched on Tyler Vella's show with him and Colton Carlson. So this is going to be an interesting discussion, I think.
I love Tyler. We had him on the show to talk about universalism, and haven't had a chance to have Colton on. Would love to get that opportunity as well. Maybe even to have both of them on to talk Calvinism with them. But yeah, Chris, we're glad you're here, and man, you're that person for me with you and Tyler. Like, I look up to you so much, and have learned a lot of, from you, especially about hell. And so I just want to thank you, and thank you for that. But Dr. Tim Stratton, it has been a minute since you have been on our episode. And for those of our listeners that don't know, real quick, we did solo episodes with both of these guys on this subject, with Tim on Molinism, and with Chris, and actually two others, Jeremiah Short, the Black Doctor, and Andrew Elliott. So I will put links to those, links in the description to those videos whenever we get done with this. And if y'all haven't yet, please go check them out. I think these two, they did a fascinating job at laying out the case, and we're just diving deeper into this subject tonight. But Dr. Stratton, if you would go ahead and give a little brief introduction about yourself for those who don't know you, and what position will you be representing tonight?
Well, yeah, again, it's first, I just want to say that Chris and I agree. We are both honored to be here tonight with you guys and with each other. And for those of that might be tuning in to look for a fight to the death, you're not going to get that tonight, because Chris and I love each other. We're brothers in Christ. And beforehand, we all had a great time of prayer together, where we were actually praying that both of us, that our ministries would be expanded because of this, that both of us, that we would work together to get toward truth. And that even though one of us has to be wrong at the end of the day, we probably aren't going to figure that out today, but we both can't be right. But it takes two to get to truth together. You got to have somebody that's advancing a belief that isn't quite right, so that the other can help get us closer to truth. And so either way, we're both advancing the ball toward the touchdown of truth tonight. And you know, and we were joking around how, you know, Augustine needed Pelagius, you know, and so yeah, we hope that that God is glorified tonight, that the kingdom is expanded, and that we can show people how to love each other and disagree. Because, man, let's face it, in the world today, I think the world has lost the art of learning how to disagree respectfully and with love. And Christians, honestly, are sometimes the worst. And I think Chris and I are going to try hard to change that tonight. So, but yeah, I'm going to defend the libertarian free will position. I'm not so much tonight looking to defend Molinism, but I will if it comes up. But I see the main topic tonight of does God determine everything or not? And so we're going to parse out what that means and look at definitions and things like that. So yeah, Chris is convinced that determinism is true, and I don't think it is. And based upon the law of the excluded middle, determinism is true or it's not. And so we both can't be right. And if I'm wrong, man, I want to know. So I'm looking forward to the talk tonight, but and I'm just honored to be here with all you guys.
Hey, Tim,
wait, hold on. One correction I have to get out there. Tim, you might be advancing a ball to a touchdown, but that football nonsense means garbage to me. I am going with you. I'm taking with you, my fellow offensive forward. I'm taking the puck up to do a one-timer in the goaltender's net. So you play football, but I'm going to stick to hockey, the better sport.
I'll give you that.
David, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tim, can you just tell us where to find your ministry and just give yourself a plug there?
Yeah, freethinkingministries.com or freethinkinc.org. Both get you to the same place. That's freethinkinc.org. That's my website. And then the Freethinking Ministries YouTube channel. I encourage people to go and subscribe, ring the bell, and do all that stuff. And also do that for Chris's channel as well. He puts out awesome content, and want to see that thing expand. And you can. I just want to highlight that both of us are professors at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. And so what's awesome about that place, that institution, is that you can go learn. You're not going to get pigeonholed into one way of thinking. You're going to learn from people who disagree, and you'll be able to decide what route to take and what views to hold. But you're going to get a well-balanced education there.
Yeah, you know, I had to disagree so hard I had to change professors.
Really?
I do go to Trinity, guys, and you know what? I was just gonna say that Tyler Vila may have Chris, but I got Tim, and you know I love both of you guys. And I do got to ask you, Chris. I do got to ask you this: is that I was taking the systematic logic class there. Were you actually a student in that class, or were you actually playing around?
No,
or were you going there messing around with people?
So when I graduated from Fuller with my master's, I wanted to go on to do an Old Testament PhD, but I have not yet had the opportunity to do so. And so because of finances and time and other things. And so for a period of time there, I had begun a PhD at Trinity in, I think, apologetics, so something along the lines of apologetics. And I got about a couple classes into that, and then I withdrew because it was just, I didn't have the time for it at the moment. So I'm kind of, that's probably where you saw me in the class. I haven't been in them since. I want to, like I said, I want to go on and do an Old Testament PhD. That's really where my passion is, and I'm just waiting for the time and opportunity.
Right on. Thanks for that.
Right on.
All right, Tyler, I'll kick it back to you, man. I'm done running my mouth here. Let's let these guys hash it out.
You sure you're done? No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so like Chris and Tim have basically gave you guys what we are going to do tonight. So again, just to reiterate, this is not a debate. However, the two are going to give 20-minute opening statements about their position, and then we're going to jump in right into open dialogue. And so again, this is an informal discussion, but I thought talking with Josh, talking with David, that it would be great to get the foundations laid out again. So for those who haven't seen the previous episodes, you can get a rehash on that. And then we will jump in with questions after this and let Chris and Tim kind of have the floor, you know, and just we pray and we hope for an organic conversation. We do have some questions for both of these gentlemen, and we also will be taking audience questions. So if you have a question for either Chris or Tim, you can go ahead, post that in the chat, put at Faith Unaltered in front, so nobody gets confused about who the question's for, whatever. And we will get to those after the open dialogue segment. And so with anything else, Josh, you got anything else that you want to add before Chris gives his opening?
No, just that I'm super pleased to be here and be a part of both of the solo discussions as well as this collaborative effort to bring everything together. And I'm just tripped out that this whole thing is still finally happening. So
me too.
I'm
Like,
happy to be here.
I love the solo episodes, but like I said, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, I think the real meat of the conversation really comes out whenever the two positions get together. And so that's what we have here. And Chris, I'm excited to hear your opening statement. So brother, I've got a timer, and I know probably you do as well. And so I will give you the solo layout, and you can begin, or I'll start the timer whenever you start speaking.
Great, I appreciate it. For the record, I don't have a timer out because we were given kind of a range of time to fit within 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm confident I'll fall under 20, not so confident I'll land at 15. So, yeah, and this is going to be a little bit more of an informal opening than I have given in many of my other more formal debates. But with all of that having been said, let's get started. So I wanted to first talk about what theological determinism is and what it isn't. I think it's my conviction, rightly or wrongly, that there's a lot of confusion and in some cases outright misrepresentation of what theological determinism is and what it entails. And I want to try and nip some of that in the bud before we get started. So first of all, an event is determined, according to Robert Kane, when there are conditions obtaining earlier, and earlier here can be temporal or logical. It doesn't have to be just temporal. When there are conditions obtaining earlier whose occurrence is a sufficient condition for the occurrence of the event. In other words, it must be the case that if these earlier determining conditions obtain, then the determined event will occur. In still other words, and to use more familiar terms, we say that a determined event is inevitable or necessary. That is to say, it cannot but occur given the determining conditions. So what then is determinism? Well, determinism is the view that whatever takes place in space-time is necessitated by antecedent conditions. That's all determinism is. But when it comes to theological determinism is the view that it is the decree of God that ultimately determines or necessitates all that takes place in time. That's about it. That's all theological determinism is. God, the decree of God is what ultimately, but not exclusively, determines or necessitates everything that takes place in time. Now let's talk about some things that it either isn't, or at the very least, there's fuzziness around the terms used. First of all, exhaustive, the qualifier that my friend and colleague Tim often uses at the beginning of divine determinism to produce the initialism EDD, that word, it just isn't needed. It's entirely superfluous because determinism just is the view that everything exhaustively in space-time is necessitated by antecedent conditions. So really, the only reason I think there is to put the word exhaustive before divine determinism is in the hope of automatically tempting people to not want to believe in it by associating it with erectile dysfunction. Right. Secondly, it's my conviction that the word causal is unhelpfully ambiguous in that it misleads, or at least often misleads people concerning the nature of divine involvement. What I mean by that is that God, in theistic determinism, in theological determinism, God needn't act on an agent in time. He's not pulling strings. So he's not implanting thoughts in a person's head. He's not coercing or manipulating a person to do this or that. He's not causing them to do what they do, that is, free agents, in the normal way that we use cause on a day-to-day basis. Also, theological determinists aren't committed to believing that God must trigger a chain of passive secondary causes. That is to say, he's not tipping dominoes or programming robots. Yes, you could say that the person who tips over the first in a long chain of dominoes causes the last domino to fall. Or you could say that a programmer who writes code that then is stored in memory or on disk and then gets executed by software, and you've got these passive secondary causes of diodes firing and causing other diodes to fire, etc. Yes, you could say the programmer causes the robot to move, but neither of those kinds of things are true in theological determinism, or at the very least needn't be true in order for antecedent conditions, including ultimately the decree of God, to necessitate every action on the part of an agent. So it seems to me that the most common ways that we in ordinary daily language use the word cause aren't fitting for the nature of divine causation in theological determinism. There is, of course, a philosophical use of the word that might be appropriate, and that is that God is the cause insofar as he is the one who ultimately renders all events necessary. But that's not the same as saying that he's a puppeteer, a programmer, and that we are like puppets who are passively being acted upon by strings, or robots being passively acted upon by the computer programmers programming. A few other caveats I want to add. In theological determinism, created agents aren't forced. They have the conditional ability to do otherwise than they do. That is to say, had situation been different, had conditions been different, had the person wanted to do differently, had their upbringing been different, had they had different experiences in childhood, etc., 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 all sorts of things like that. If things had been different, they could have done otherwise. But all conditions being what they were, in fact, means that those conditions do necessitate the event. So they have the conditional, just not categorical, ability to do otherwise. They are not forced. Also, in theological determinism, created agents aren't passive. I recently watched a video where my friend Tim had J.P. Moreland, I think it was, on his show, and J.P. Moreland was insanely suggesting that in theological determinism, we are mere passive agents. We're not even agents. We're just passive cogs in a machine, but that's ridiculous. In theological determinism, created agents aren't passive. We deliberate, we choose, and we act, we will, we have volition, things that are none of which are true of cogs in a machine. And thirdly, created agents in theological determinism aren't coerced or manipulated. We do what we naturally choose to do. What we naturally choose to do isn't being overridden by some kind of manipulative conditions or ideas being implanted in our brains or anything like that, that some indeterminists or some libertarians like to claim is true of our view. It's just not. All right, so with that sort of introduction having been given, let me talk about theological determinism and the ideas of freedom and responsibility. According to a determinist like me, meaningful freedom is the ability to act as desired, unimpeded, unconstrained by forces outside of my control, unimpeded by things that are happening from without. As Robert Kane puts it, to be free, as we ordinarily understand the word, is to have the power or ability to do what we want or desire to do, which in turn entails an absence of constraints or impediments, things like restraints, coercion, and compulsion that would prevent us from doing what we want. This is a pretty textbook definition of compatibilist free will, a freedom that we exercise that is compatible with determinism. Secondly, categorical ability to do other than what one does just is not required for responsibility. And I think a good way of getting at the truth of this statement is by looking at Frankfurt cases. Here's an example of one reproduced or reconstructed by John Fisher. Imagine that Black has secretly inserted a chip in Jones's brain, and if Jones were to show any inclination to vote for McCain, the chip would intervene to assure that he actually decides to vote for Obama. But Jones decides to vote for Obama on his own, without the chip taking effect. And so Jones can be held morally responsible for voting for Obama, even though it was not possible for him to choose otherwise. Okay, because if he had begun to, if he were inclined to, the chip would have overridden, and it didn't. So he did it on its own. He was held morally responsible, even though there was no categorical ability to do otherwise. And then some indeterminists or libertarians argue that if it's not the principle of alternative possibility or the categorical ability to do otherwise that is a requirement or a requisite for freedom, if it's not that, then what is a requirement for genuine freedom is that you are the ultimate source of your actions. And what I want to argue is that guidance control, not ultimate sourcehood, is sufficient to ground meaningful freedom and moral responsibility. So what do I mean by guidance control? Well, Fisher and Ravizza, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, they say that an agent exhibits guidance control of an action insofar as the mechanism that actually issues in the action is his own reasons-responsive mechanism. We're going to get into that a little bit more detail, but Preciado, in a Reformed view of freedom, rightly points out that this concept of guidance control has two main components: moderate reasons responsiveness and mechanism ownership. So let's talk about those two things in turn. Michael McKenna explains in the Oxford Handbook of Free Will that reasons-responsive theories of freedom account for free will in terms of the relation between an agent and her reasons for action. Free agents are those who, when acting intentionally, are in some manner sensitive to a suitable range of reasons for action. Now, there's strong versions of reasons responsiveness and weak versions of reasons responsiveness. The one that I'm advocating here for is what's called a moderate form of reasons responsiveness, which requires that an agent act on a mechanism that is regularly receptive to reasons, some of which are moral reasons, and at least weakly reactive to reasons. To see the distinction between receptivity to reasons versus reactivity to reasons, consider what Paul says in Romans 7:18. I have the desire to do what is right. Right? He understands, he's receptive to the fact that there are reasons to do what is right, and he wants to do those things, at least in some sense of wanting and to some degree. But then he goes on to say, I don't have the ability to carry it out. He's weak-willed, just like all of us, whose wills are influenced at the very least by the stain of sin. So Paul, like all of us, are regularly receptive to reasons, but we are weakly reactive to them because we are weak-willed. Now, as for the concept of one's own mechanism of action, Fisher and Ravizza say this: an agent's actions may be produced by a variety of different mechanisms, including the normal exercise of practical reason, non-reflective habit, and, for example, direct stimulation of the brain. And when an agent takes responsibility, he is accepting responsibility for only those actions which flow from a certain source, from a particular kind of mechanism. To put it another way, Preciado says that the electronic stimulation of the brain is a mechanism that causes an action, but a morally responsible agent does not take responsibility for this kind of mechanism because it doesn't originate from the right source. But he would take responsibility for the mechanism and the actions that spring forth from the normal exercise of practical reason and non-reflective habit. That's one's own mechanism. One's own reasons-responsive mechanism. So what I'm arguing here is that on theological determinism, created agents act from their own reasons-responsive mechanism, like deliberation. Excuse me, I knocked something over on my desk. Secondly, their actions spring naturally from their own internal desires, predispositions, and beliefs. They're not being acted upon from without by God or from anything else to perform the actions they do. No, their actions spring naturally from their own internal desires, predispositions, and beliefs. And then thirdly, although an agent's actions on this view are indeed necessitated by prior conditions, they are nevertheless their own actions, and they are freely chosen by their own reasons-responsive mechanism that is receptive to reasons, but weakly reactive to them because their will is affected by sin. So lastly, having laid all that out on the table, why do I embrace theological determinism rather than Molinism? See, this debate would be very different. Debate's not the right word. We're having a friendly conversation. But this conversation would be very different if I were having it with, say, my simple Arminian friend, David Paulman, or my provisionist friend, Leighton Flowers, or the open theist, Will Duffy. Those would be different conversations. But with my friend Tim, we both affirm what Tim in his debate with Dr. White called the divine foreordaining of all that will happen, which he calls predestination. We both affirm that. And probably, I would bet we'd point to many of the same biblical texts in support of that concept of divine foreordination of everything that takes place in space and time. So what that means then is whether that biblical data supports determinism or Molinism might be a philosophical question primarily. Now, I'm not convinced that it is primarily or exclusively a philosophical question, but I'm going to grant that for the sake of this conversation because, again, I think that there is at least some degree to which my friend Tim, as a Molinist, can affirm the truthfulness of texts that he and I would both point to in support of divine foreordination of everything. So I'm going to try to tackle this from a bit of a more philosophical or logical perspective rather than a biblical one, although my beliefs do spring primarily from Scripture. So the first reason I want to argue for determinism over Molinism is the concept of Occam's razor. Occam's razor is often very misused, very misunderstood. There is no rule called Occam's razor that says that you must believe and that the only thing that is true is the simplest explanation. That's not how Occam's razor works. But what it does allow you to do is prioritize lists of competing theories, prioritize them for assessment. If you have competing theories and one of them is very complex and another is very simple, it will take you a lot longer and there'll be a lot more effort going into assessing the truthfulness or plausibility of the more complex explanation. So Occam's razor says you should first assess the simpler explanations, and if those are sufficient to account for the data, then they are preferable to more complex ones. Well, it's my conviction, rightly or wrongly, that Molinism is a much more complex system because you have to introduce the concept of middle knowledge, you have to introduce the concept of feasible worlds, you have to believe that that it's possible for God to infallibly foreknow the actions of agents that never exist, that he never decrees to create, that don't have any real form to them at all. They're just a hypothetical. I'm not saying all of that's reason to disbelieve in Molinism. I'm just saying there's a lot more parameters and assumptions and factors in Molinism than there is in theological determinism. So for me, because of what I just got done explaining about freedom and responsibility, I see no reason to think that determinism is insufficient to account for the biblical data, so I'm going to favor it over the more complex Molinism. Secondly, there's the grounding objection. I don't think the grounding objection is the final nail in the coffin or a silver bullet that rules out Molinism. But the grounding objection does say that you can't have, or at the very least it's difficult to conceive of how one can have infallible foreknowledge of agents' unnecessitated actions. And it seems to me that my friend Tim's response to that is just omniscience, and that's kind of the answer. But I don't think that answer goes far enough to answer this objection in a way that would make me more inclined to consider Molinism than determinism, given that determinism is already sufficient to explain the data. And then lastly, it seems to me there's nothing gained on Molinism. It's presented often. In fact, my friend Tim, in his debate with Dr. White, did a Avengers dying Iron Man thumb snap to show, as if he's wearing the gauntlet with all the stones in it, to say that the problem of evil vanishes on Molinism. But I don't think that's true. Remember, determinism is just the view that one's actions are necessitated by antecedent conditions. Well, on Molinism, it is necessarily the case that one will do what God foreknows one will do. It's just a different place in the sentence that necessity comes in. In both cases, regardless of whether it's Molinism or determinism that's true, when you act, it was necessarily the case that you do what you do because God infallibly foreknew it in Molinism, or because antecedent conditions necessitated it in determinism. And as such, I don't see it as being a meaningful answer to the problem of evil any better than determinism. And for those three reasons and others, I'm inclined to think that I'm well within my, I'm on good footing to embrace the simpler determinism than the more complex and fraught with more difficulty Molinism. And with that, I'm finished. So thank you.
Right on, Chris. Thank you so much for that opening statement. And Tim, if you want, let me go ahead and get you on the solo layout here. And the minute you start speaking, sir, I will start the timer.
Well, I consider Chris Date to be a dear friend, a valued colleague, and a brother in Christ. Not only is he a force to be reckoned with when it comes to debate or just disagreements on YouTube, his well-reasoned arguments have shaped important aspects of my theology. So for that, I'm grateful. With that said, Chris and I disagree on so many points of theology, yet we love each other anyway. Well, tonight, I hope that the two of us can model how to disagree while still exemplifying love gentleness, and respect to one another. The topic of our disagreement tonight is that of determinism. Not so much Calvinism versus Molinism, but I'm sure we'll get into that. I contend that multiple arguments can be made against determinism. For example, I've argued that determinism opposes Scripture. I've argued that if determinism is true, then true love is impossible. I've also argued that if determinism is true, then the moral argument for God's existence fails. Indeed, if divine determinism is true, then I contend that the problems of evil and divine hiddenness are monumental. Tonight, however, I'm simply going to focus on one specific problem of evil, referred to as the problem of epistemic evil. Now, it's imperative to define terms before we begin. An event is determined if antecedent conditions, natural, supernatural, or both, are sufficient to necessitate an event. For example, the Kalam cosmological argument demonstrates that antecedent supernatural conditions are sufficient to necessitate the creation of the universe. The fine-tuning argument demonstrates that antecedent supernatural conditions that transcend the universe are sufficient to necessitate certain effects via secondary causes within the universe. Now, determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all events or effects. This is often referred to as causal determinism, but the word causal can be dropped without problem. Guillaume Mignon writes, "The main idea behind determinism is that everything that comes to pass is determined or necessitated by prior conditions, natural or supernatural." Mignon continues, "If the word causal is used at all, as in the phrase causal determinism, it shall not mean anything more than determinism simpliciter." Now, exhaustive divine determinism, and in the conversation that follows this, I'll give reasons as to why this is used. But exhaustive divine determinism, hereafter EDD or ED, is the idea that God necessitates all events via primary, secondary, efficient, or deficient means. ED is specifically concerned with God's determination of all things about humanity, which would include all desires, wants, sins, thoughts, intuitions, beliefs, actions, behaviors, evaluations, judgments, and deliberations. In contrast to human choices being determined is the libertarian freedom to think, judge, and be more careful in a certain circumstance. Richard Taylor puts it this way: "In the case of an action that is free, it must not only be such that it's caused by the agent who performs it, but also such that no antecedent conditions were sufficient for his performing just that action." We can understand libertarian freedom then as the ability to choose such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine or necessitate one's choice. This definition could be applied to thinking. Libertarian freedom includes the ability to think such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine or necessitate one's thoughts and ensuing beliefs. This application of libertarian freedom to thinking holds whether or not one possesses alternative possibilities from which to choose. One simply needs to be the first mover of these choices and thoughts. This idea can be referred to as weak libertarian freedom. However, if one does face opportunities to choose among alternative possibilities in the real world, strong libertarian freedom, and has the power to choose among them with no changes in the mental conditions at the time of choice, then it follows that one is not determined by something or someone else. We can understand strong libertarian freedom in this manner: the opportunity to exercise an ability to choose between at least two options, each of which is compatible with one's nature in a specific circumstance where the antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine or necessitate the agent's choice. Now, that's a fancy way of saying the ability to do otherwise, and I've argued that this is implied in 1 Corinthians 10:13, as well as other passages of Scripture. Now, it's vital to note that antecedent conditions are either sufficient or insufficient to necessitate all events. The following thought experiment illustrates the necessity of libertarian freedom when it comes to rationality and the active use of reason. Suppose a transcendent demon somehow uses his supernatural powers to exhaustively control and determine all of your thoughts and beliefs all the time. This includes exactly what you think of and about, and more importantly, exactly how you think of and about it. All of your thoughts about your beliefs and all of your beliefs about your thoughts are now determined by the demon. You have no opportunity to think or believe otherwise. Moreover, you have zero guidance control over what you think of or how you think about it. All of your passive thoughts are completely up to and at the mercy of the whims of the demon. You do not have the control condition required for rational responsibility. In other words, you do not meet the control condition if something or someone else is in complete control of your condition. That is to say, if something non-rational or someone else who is untrustworthy determines all of your reasoning and exactly how you reason, then there's reason to doubt your reasoning. If something or someone else controls how you reason, then there is reason to doubt your use of reason. Indeed, you would lack the kind of libertarian agency to actively use your reason. Instead, your succession of thoughts would not be yours at all, but rather those of your controller. If you are not a libertarian free thinker, then something or someone else is ultimately in control over all of your thoughts, all of your intuitions, your beliefs, evaluations, and judgments, all of it. You also do not have control over the next words that will form in your mind or come out of your mouth. If all things are determined, then you have no active control over any of your thoughts, which seems to be antithetical to the teachings of both Jesus and Paul. What's more, or rather much less, you are nothing but a passive cog, as epistemologist John DePoe has indicated. On determinism, quote, ultimately, the human agent is downgraded from being a person with active powers of rationality to a passive cog that is at the mercy of causes beyond one's control, end quote. Well, not only does this passive cogness seem to oppose the teachings of Scripture, it also stands opposed to our direct experience. Speaking of our direct experience of the libertarian freedom to actively think and take thoughts captive, as the Apostle Paul would say, J.P. Moreland has observed the following, quote, most of us are quite aware of the different what it is like, the different phenomenological texture, and having a passive thought and an active thought, one to which I exercise my active power and choose to attend. This difference is self-evident to introspective awareness, and such awarenesses provide grounds for the proper basicality of one's belief that one has and can exercise active power. Now, sure, a passive cog might possess passive awareness, but one would never have active control of what one is aware of on this deterministic view. One would not possess the ability or the power to be more careful while thinking things through. One's level of so-called carefulness is also determined by the same deceptive demon. Now, if determinism is true, then when one passively experiences sensations of deliberation about what one ought to believe, the fact of the matter is that every other belief option, besides what the demon determined the person to believe, was closed off and locked away from the person's access. It might have subjectively seemed as if the person experiencing these sensations of deliberations could have accessed these other options, but objectively speaking, it was an illusion also determined by the same demon. The ability to actively choose to be more careful and do one's due diligence while thinking things through seems to be a power worth wanting. With this in mind, if one is still clutching to determinism, another question arises. How can you, not the demon, rationally affirm your current inferred beliefs as good, bad, better, the best, worst, the worst, true, false, probably true, or probably false, without begging the question? This seems to be an impossible task. Epistemologist Jim Slagle makes the point, quote, according to determinism, the only methods by which we could examine such processes are products of these processes themselves. To appeal to the reliability of these processes in arguing for their reliability is an invalid procedure. To appeal to these processes in order to verify the reliability of these processes is simply and blatantly to beg the question, end quote. Well, no matter how you respond, the response is not from you as a source, but ultimately determined by and up to the demon. That is to say, unless you have libertarian freedom, the response will not be from you. It simply passes through you. Slagle continues, quote, there must be an explanation for a belief. It must be a good explanation, and it must be my explanation. In order for it to be my explanation, I have to accept it. If my acceptance is also determined by extrinsic forces, then in what sense is it my explanation? In fact, how could the resulting state be called a belief at all? Belief seems to involve both reception of information and some level of assent or approval of it. After all, we often receive information that we do not subsequently believe. So clearly, mere reception of information is an insufficient definition of belief. I may not have to originate the explanation of the belief, but I do have to make whatever explanation there is my explanation for believing it. And this would suggest that determinism is incompatible with belief. And so belief in determinism, including Ed, is self-defeating, end quote. Now, self-defeat is the last thing a rational person wants. Sure, the demon could determine you to hold some true beliefs, but you would never be in a position to judge, evaluate, or know if what the demon is causing you to believe is correct, since your judgments and evaluations are also determined by the same demon. This is why it does not matter if the external controller, unlike the demon, has morally sufficient reasons to deceive you. You're still deceived. Given determinism, a human is not an active, deliberating agent. As a result, a human would have no real ability to reason through syllogisms or engage in any intellectually responsible mental acts. Thus, it may be the case that one's thoughts, beliefs, and so forth are true, but no one would ever be able to know that by reasoning. Moreover, on determinism, we stand in no position to judge or evaluate what false beliefs this demon is imposing upon us, while also determining us to think those false beliefs are good, true, or probably true. We would have no ability to choose to accept or reject information. Our so-called acceptance or rejection of new information is also not up to us, but determined by the demon, either directly or how he programmed, determined, and fine-tuned our cognitive belief-forming faculties to operate. Remember, we are discussing exhaustive determinism. That's why I use that word. Everything that happens during our so-called reasoning process happens exactly the way the demon desires and determines, even when we reason poorly. To make matters worse, this demon even makes some people believe that he's infallible so that they can trust the beliefs he imposes upon them. For that matter, he can make people believe that he has all of the divine attributes. Thus, according to deterministic views, we have undercutting defeaters to many important beliefs. If the demon controls and determines your entire thought life, directly or indirectly, then one would not be in a position to judge for himself, as the Apostle Paul mandates in 1 Corinthians 10:15, whether one ought to accept information and believe it or reject information and not believe it. The ability worth wanting to accept or reject information is not under your control, but rather the control of the demon. Indeed, when one subjectively feels they are evaluating or judging a currently affirmed belief to see if it should be affirmed as true or false, in reality, the same transcendent demon of deception who determined the affirmation of the false belief in the first place is also the same demon who is determining the so-called evaluation of the affirmed false belief. This would be akin to fact checkers assuring you that a particular cable news channel is reliable and not fake news. But then you find out that the so-called fact checkers are employed by the same cable news network. If that's the case, no epistemic progress has been made. The fact is that if we do not possess libertarian freedom, then something non-rational or someone untrustworthy, like a deceptive demon, is determining all of your thoughts and beliefs. If something non-rational or someone untrustworthy determines a person to affirm a false belief in a certain circumstance, then he or she has no ability to infer a better or true belief in that same circumstance. Suppose, for example, that God, the creator of the universe, determines Pastor Jones to study scripture for decades and finally conclude that the conditional immortality view of hell, annihilationism, is false and heretical. Unbeknownst to Pastor Jones, however, in actuality, Chris Date's view of conditional immortality is true. If that's the case, and God determines Jones to think Chris Date's view of hell is false until the day he dies, then Jones can't do anything to infer a better or true belief about hell, and Pastor Jones will teach his entire congregation this false theological belief, and to also reject the teachings of Chris Date as a heretic. On this deterministic view, God is untrustworthy, and Pastor Jones cannot infer better or true beliefs about hell, although Jones will tell you otherwise and confidently declare that he has rationally reached his conclusion and that he is, in fact, proclaiming the truth about hell and that Chris Date is a heretic. But he's wrong, determined by God. If one has no idea which of his or her theological beliefs are false, then he or she cannot rationally affirm which theological beliefs are true. This ability to infer better and true beliefs seems to be a power worth wanting, and more importantly, one with which we have an intimate, introspective awareness. The ability to rationally affirm claims of knowledge also seems to be a power worth wanting. In fact, that's a power we have. If one disagrees, one seems to assume that he or she has that power too. With all of that said, consider the words of notable Calvinist Matthew J. Hart. Quote, Calvinists are theological determinists. They hold that God causes every contingent event, either directly or indirectly, end quote. Now, this means that God, according to Calvinistic determinism, causes each and every thought and belief, including all of our false, irrational, sinful, and evil beliefs. Speaking of Calvinists, let's go to the horse's mouth. John Calvin wrote, quote, the will of God is the supreme and primary cause of all things, end quote. In his work titled The Providence of God, Calvinist Paul Helms seals the deal. Quote, not only is every thought and desire kept in being by God, but every twist and turn of each of these is under the direct control of God. He has not, as far as we know, delegated that control to anyone else, end quote. Now, Scripture suggests otherwise and seems to be clear that we do have some active control of our thoughts and ultimately some of our important beliefs. After all, the Apostle Paul declares that we are the kind of creature who can take certain thoughts captive, 2 Corinthians 10:5, before they take us, Colossians 2:8. Thus, these thoughts Paul refers to cannot be necessitated by antecedent conditions which are outside of our control. Since no one is theologically infallible, it follows that every theologian affirms false theological beliefs. If that's the case, it follows that God determines all people, including all theists, which includes all Calvinists, to affirm false theological beliefs. This would mean that our Creator is not a God of truth who desires all people to know the truth, as opposed to what 1 Timothy 2:4 says, and instead, our Creator is relegated to a deity of deception. If this is the case, not only do Christians lose the power to rationally infer and affirm truth, it seems that the deity of Ed is anything but the God of truth. If God is relegated to a deity of deception, something far less than a maximally great being, then God does not seem to be significantly different from a Cartesian demon. And if a demon or a deity of deception determines all of your theological beliefs, then there is reason to doubt your theological beliefs, including those discussed tonight. Indeed, if determinism is true, one's level of assent or approval of information is determined by something or someone else. If that something or someone else is untrustworthy, just as a demon, a god of mischief, or a deity of deception would be, then undercutting defeaters abound. Accordingly, justification and rational affirmation devolve into question-begging assumptions. If that's the case,
Tim.
All right, let me get through this final syllogism.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then knowledge is illusory. John DePoe is clear. Quote, given that the nature of justification requires some sense of freedom or autonomy, Ed is incompatible with humans possessing knowledge. Here's a syllogism I'd like to end with. Premise 1. If Ed is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. 2. If God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive and his word, the Bible, cannot be trusted. 3. God is not deceptive, and his word can be trusted. 4, therefore, God does not determine all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. 5, therefore, Ed is false. And I have more, but I'll leave it at that.
Wow, gentlemen, great. I was just wondering where I should send my tuition.
Well, I mean, you're going to the school that both of them teach at, so you know.
Right on, right on. Well, guys, we're going to enter into the free dialogue state. Tyler, I'll kick it to you to lay out the format a little bit.
I like how you put free in there. That was cute. But anyway, no, we're just going to, I mean, it's simple. Like I said in the beginning, this isn't a debate. And so we kind of all have the floor really to discuss these concepts and what, well, Chris left the free dialogue. See, you shouldn't have said free, David. And that's exactly what happened. No, I'm just kidding. But I think Chris will be right back. But anyway.
Can I say something really quick? I'm getting some feedback or something.
I am too. Josh, is that from? That is from Josh. Okay. All right. But no, I mean, like I said, this is just a free open dialogue. And so I want to actually kick this off with the question about causation. And so Tim, you had mentioned cause in your opening statement right there about the end. And Chris, I just want to get your thoughts, because we talked about in the episode that you and I did with Andrew and Jeremiah, and you guys were not a fan of the term cause, because God is not causing anyone to do anything except, you know, whenever we talked about regeneration, God's actively working in people at that point, right?
Or if he's hardening somebody's heart. Yeah.
Right, vice versa. And so my question is, even though God being the ultimate cause, by decreeing these things to happen, I'm trying to get at is, what's the difference between God causing it by decreeing it outside of space-time and God causing it in space-time actively? Does that make sense?
Well, it does. It just seems to me that the distinction is so obviously self-evident. If you have a puppeteer pulling the strings on a marionette, that puppeteer is causing the puppet to move. But there's action being taken directly on a passive piece of wood by the puppeteer. Or take a computer programmer, a robot programmer. You've got, again, somebody taking direct action that through a passive causal chain just results in an inanimate, unthinking object to react mechanistically to the programming that is executed in the on the motherboard or what have you. So it's not merely just a matter of transcendence. It's a matter of passivity. It's a matter of, like I said, guidance, control, reasons, responsiveness. Look, just because the choice that I make as a result of my reasons responsive mechanism internal to myself of deliberation, just because that action is predetermined doesn't mean that God is causing it in any meaningful sense that is comparable to the sense in which a puppeteer causes a puppet to move or a programmer causes a robot to move. At that point, I think what's going on is we're just illegitimately equivocating on what the word cause means. We're treating the word cause in the puppeteer and robot case as if it's meaningfully analogous, meaningfully synonymous with the word cause when we're talking about the God who created a universe in which everything would happen just as he determined it to do. And I'm just unwilling to equivocate on the word cause like that.
It is the main difference.
Can I respond? Yeah. So let me read from Guillaume Bignon's book here. Page 201, he says, Agent A causes event E. Let's see, here he says, we can simply take Agent A causes event E to mean Agent A engages in an activity that necessarily results. So he's talking about necessity here. Necessarily results in the occurrence of event E. So if that's the case, this is completely compatible with a definition of force. If somebody is going to use their power to necessitate an event one way or the other, whether that power transcends the universe or is within the space-time universe or whatever, if one uses their power via decree or whatever to necessitate an event to occur, then that is antecedent conditions forcing the event to occur. But if you don't like to use the word force, we can simply say necessitating. That is what we mean by that. But I just want to make a couple comments here. And this is why I continue, it's not to get people to think about erectile dysfunction. It is to highlight that we are talking about everything because...
Yeah, but that's what determinism already is. I mean, that's the point that has been made to you on many occasions. You're adding exhaustive to a word that already means exhaustive.
Right, and J.P. Moreland and I have pushed back on that and explained why this is necessary, because determinists often steal from libertarianism to argue against libertarianism. And when we stick that word exhaustive there, that helps people say, oh, wait, that's determined too. So when you say, hey, but this is my reasons responsiveness. Yeah, the same reasons responsiveness that is causally or even just plain determined by the demon of deception or the deity of deception. The way you respond is not up to you, but determined by the demon or the deity of deception. The way you reason, the way you respond to reasons is also not up to you. That's been determined by a deceptive deity or a demon. None of it is up to you, and that's why we use the word E. Now, let me just say...
That's totally false. It's not the case that it's not up to us. It's just not ultimately up to us.
It is. Look, and JP and I discussed this at length in our paper, which just came out today, by the way. It's published. And JP does a great job of highlighting exactly why it is not false, but it is correct. And if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate an effect about how you reason, then how you reason is not up to you, but to the antecedent conditions. It's just that simple. Now,
I understand that bald assertion, but that is all it is. It's not ultimately up to me, but that doesn't mean that it's not up to me at all.
Okay, let's think about this. All right, nothing. Okay, you brought up robots and puppeteers. Nothing about a robot is up to a robot. Nothing about a puppet is up to the puppet. If Ed is true, if exhaustive divine determinism
is true. If determinism is true, yeah. If theological determinism is true.
God determines everything exhaustively. And if Ed is true, then nothing, I mean, look, it's in the literature now, and at least three, I mean, John DePoe has used it even, and I quoted him. But if Ed, he hasn't said that in the literature, but the quote he gave me was for me for this talk. JP Moreland has used it. We've explained why we use it. So we're just going to keep using it to highlight.
Fine, and I'm just going to keep not, because there's no reason to.
Look, you can. I just don't want you to interrupt me and say that I can't.
Actually, get to a question. You go ahead.
Okay. Nothing about a robot is up to a robot. Nothing about a puppet is up to a puppet. If God determines everything exhaustively, then nothing about a human is up to a human, including how you think and reason. The entire show, and this is why Moreland does call it a puppet show, is necessitated by antecedent conditions completely up to someone else, in this case, a deity of deception who determines you to hold false theological beliefs. Now, Leighton Flowers has already explained this nicely, and let me clarify with 3 points. Calvinists understand Paul's metaphor in Romans 9 in such a way that the potter determines all things about the clay puppet. Puppets and programmers determine all things about puppets and robots. And if potters determine all things about clay pots and puppeteers and programmers determine all things about puppets and robots, then it seems that it's a fair analogy. It's just to a modern day audience. So look, if everything about a puppet and a robot is determined, and let's just assume that a robot could actually think and have thoughts, they have intentional states of consciousnesses, then their intentional states of consciousnesses would be up to the programmer as well, and of that antecedent condition. And so I'm just saying that if that's true, if God determines, I mean, that's what determinism means. If I just say determinism without exhaustive, that's just what it means, that God determines everything, then that means your intentional states of consciousness is also determined by God, and then he determines you to hold false beliefs about him and ultimate reality. So how would you, Chris, deal with that last argument that I gave, that about if determinism is true, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive. And if that's the case, then it seems like the whole system is going to blow up. We can't even trust the Bible or trust that we have assurance of salvation or anything like that. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd love to answer that question, but you said about 18,543 things in that long 5-minute long monologue. So let me say a few things. So, well, you're not, sorry, but anyway.
Well, I will mute my mic for a while.
Okay. So number one, I mean, gosh, I don't even know where to begin. There's so much there. So number one, the difference, the obvious, self-evident difference between anybody that is actually thinking openly about this topic. And by the way, MJ Jackson, you're right. I was about to blow up because I kept looking at my imaginary watch, looking for an opportunity to say something contrary-wise. But anyway, the obvious self-evident difference is exactly what I said in my opening presentation. A puppet, a robot, these kinds of things don't have guidance control. They don't have reasons responsiveness. And the mechanism, if they were given some kind of consciousness or whatever, but it's sort of pretend passive consciousness and they're just doing whatever they're programmed to do, it's not their own reasons responsive mechanism. Only a will, only a volition like we humans have, even in determinism, where you are, to use the words that I quoted in my opening, regularly receptive to reasons and at least weakly reactive to reasons. That kind of, and as long as that mechanism is internal to oneself, it's not imposed from without by a programmer or by a mad scientist pulling your brain neurons to fire in a certain way. None of that's true. Even if my choices are necessitated by antecedent conditions, if I'm regularly receptive to reasons and weakly at least reactive to those reasons, and if the mechanism of deliberation, of even non-reflective habit, but if it's my own mechanism internal to within myself, it doesn't matter if the actions that I take are necessitated. It is still free and respectful. Now, as for the question you're asking, I think your repeated use of transcendent demon and deity of deception, it's rhetorically very powerful, but I don't see any reason to find it compelling in the least. Yes, in my view, and in the view of any theological determinist, God is predetermining people, everybody, to hold false beliefs. That's absolutely true. But it doesn't follow from that God is a deity of deception any more than that would be true of Molinism, in which God, looking at a myriad number of possible and feasible worlds, decides to actualize a world in which Christ believes in a false view, instead of actualizing a world in which I believe the right thing. In either case, God is not determining. Either way, God is predestining, to use your word, a world in which he knows I am going to believe something false instead of a world he could have actualized in which I believe something that's true. Now, I could imagine a Molinist retorting with, yeah, but maybe it's the case that there are no feasible worlds in which you believe the true thing instead of the false. But it seems to me to strain credulity if one wants to suggest that literally every false belief I have is one that is something I have in every feasible world. I mean, at this point, you're just going to, at this point, to say that every feasible world is one in which I believe a false thing is just to say, in using different terminology, that my false beliefs are determined. And I don't see that to me is like a distinction without a difference, or a difference without a distinction, whichever way that plays out. Moreover, and this will be my last comment in response, and we can go back and forth some more, the Bible just does say that God deceives and deludes people. He sends spirits of deception. He sends a strong delusion so that people won't repent and believe in statements to that effect. So whether you're a Molinist or whether you're a determinist or whether you're an Arminian, provisionist, or open theist, either way, we all have to grapple with the biblical data that says that God at times acts or has acted in order to guarantee that somebody believes something false. That's true of you. It's true of me. And unless you're willing to say that you believe in a deity of deception, I'm not willing to say as much.
All right, that was a good response, Chris. Took some notes there. When you say it's self-evident, these differences are self-evident. All right, what is self-evident to one person and to the other who may or may not disagree is also determined by the deity of deception or the demon on that view. So you're begging the question there. I'm making a point that none of your thoughts, what might be evident to you or how you judge something, how you evaluate something when you read scripture and you reach one conclusion and I read it and reach another conclusion. If you're right, if Ed is true, then none of that is up to us. So what is self-evident to you is actually not up to you, but up to a deceptive deity or demon. When you say when those who are willing to think openly on it, I would say that that's a language that is consistent with the libertarian to use. But if somebody is determined in all of their thoughts, they are not, how they think of and about things, whether they're open or closed or whatever, is not up to them. It's also determined by antecedent conditions, which necessitate their thoughts. You brought up guidance control, but again, on Ed, that's why I use EDD over and over and over. And I said it in my opening speech. You are not guiding. The antecedent conditions are. You feel it's a subjective sensation you're experiencing on exhaustive divine determinism, but how you guide is not up to you. You're a passive passenger. If determinism is true, something or someone else is determining how you, in quotes, guide. It's not up to you. You're a passive passenger, not a driver when it comes to deliberations. And then you brought up being regularly receptive. Again, determined by God. I have to bring in the exhaustive again. You brought up the mechanism of deliberation being within myself. Yes, that might be within yourself just as your heartbeat is, but that's also determined by God, a deity of deception on this view. Now, you said the idea of deception is also true on Molinism. Let me get through these points and I'll throw it back to you. You said a deity of deception is also true on Molinism. That's false. Yes, we do. You and I both agree on predestination, but the manner of which the mechanism, as some people have said, is vital here, because, and we can bring up the bullet bill analogy on Molinism, or I'm sorry, on Calvinism. God is the necessary and sufficient cause of all of your false theological beliefs, including those that we may be discussing tonight, or anything else. God is the necessary and sufficient cause on Molinism. He's merely the necessary cause and not the sufficient. And that's a huge difference in why ultimately the bullet bill story fails. And we can go into bullet bill more if you'd like. I've got a lot ready to say on that. But then he said finally that the Bible says that God deceives. Yes. Who does he deceive? Those who have already rejected truth. God sends a spirit of deception as judgment to those who have already rejected him. Now, it would be quite odd to say that God sends a spirit of judgment to those that he has determined to reject truth. That just seems absurd to me. But yeah, the Bible, my argument is pointing out that all Christians are ultimately deceived by God.
Okay, so really quick, just a few thoughts in response. First of all, I'm not going to accept your contention that it's not up to me if it's predetermined. And you made the claim that I'm not guiding, I'm just a passive cog, but that's just not the case. If can I talk?
Yeah, sorry.
So it seems to me that if I am deliberating between reasons, if I am capable of identifying competing reasons for doing this or that, and if I am weak-willed, weakly reactive, but nevertheless at least weakly reactive to those reasons. So sometimes those reasons result in me choosing the right belief, the right course of action rather than the false one or whatever. Then it is true, not ultimately up to me if my choice as a result of that deliberation process is predetermined, but it does not follow from that it is not up to me at all, or that I'm passive. To pretend that it is just pretense, that all it is passive, an action going through you, that's just words. Those are just words that don't have any substance to them. To say that somebody who deliberates is able to identify competing reasons and reacts to one of them of their own volition, but that reaction was determined, does not make it not up to them at all or make them passive, in my opinion. And as for bullet bill, I think it would be useful. You've mentioned it now a couple of times to, I know what you're referring to there by bullet bill, but many of our listeners might not. Do you want to describe the bullet bill scenario so that, and I'll come back and explain why I do think that as a Molinist, your approach to that is a distinction without a difference?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, I don't know why this is for me. I get so nervous when I have even online disagreements. And I'm feeling it like it was bad in my debate with James White, and I felt myself get all flustered. I got all cottonmouth. It's happening again right now. And I just don't know what's up with that. So
told you to stop smoking that ganja. It gives you conscience. No,
I was going to say, look, I'm seeing myself get uptight, and Chris, you and I talked beforehand. That's not how I want to come across. So I just want to take a big breath, step back, and have a fun disagreement again. And it's my fault. I just get all riled up.
It's not just your fault. It's mine too. But I think that one thing that would help is if we try to get to a question or a point quickly. I'm not saying that you're uniquely guilty of doing otherwise. We both could be said to be guilty of that. Yeah. But there's not going to be a conversation at all if we just talk and talk and talk for 5 minutes and then at the end ask a question about the 19th thing we said. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I'll try to be shorter as well.
Yeah, both you guys are doing it. Both of y'all are jumping in a little bit, but y'all are doing pretty good at kind of like saying, hey, let me finish this. And, it doesn't need much moderation in that aspect. And I was just saying, you guys are doing great. I think, and you know what? People are learning a lot. I mean, you just see the comments. People are asking questions, stuff like that. It's really good. So,
tell my heart. Yeah, go ahead.
Me too. My heart's racing too. So taking a step back, in the interest of listeners learning, I'd love for you if you could explain the bullet bill scenario, and then I can explain why I think it does make Molinism just as objectionable as Calvinism, and then you can rebut that, and then we'll move on. How's that?
Well, okay, yeah. I'll try to do my best here. Off the top of my head, to describe Greg Welty's very thoughtful scenario and an analogy. It's been called a fallacy, but I don't think it really is a fallacy. It can be. So it's called a U2 fallacy or tu quoque fallacy. But sometimes, if it's used properly, you can avoid the fallacy. And I think he did avoid a fallacious move here. But basically, it's like, okay, Molinism, well, you say that God gets you off the hook for evil. Well, you say that Calvinists are on the hook for evil, and Greg Welty's going to say, no, you too, you've got the same problem. And so he's developed this thought experiment where, just basically in a nutshell, shows like, look, if somebody shoots a bullet, with the current laws of nature and the way bullets and guns operate at a person, we see that person is guilty for shooting the person with the bullet. But what if the bullet was the bullet from Mario Brothers or Super Mario Brothers, named Bullet Bill, and he actually had free will, and you fired the bullet, and you're not determining Bullet Bill as the firer of the gun, as the one who pulled the trigger. You're not determining him because he's got free will, but that Bullet Bill will, infallibly, you're certain, 100% certain that Bullet Bill is going to freely choose to kill the guy. How are you not also blameworthy for that, for firing the gun? So what would you say to that, Chris? What would you add?
Yeah, great. So I think that it does seem to me that we've got two competing pictures here. One is a person fires a gun intending for the bullet to pierce the heart of another person and kill them or whatever. And on the other case, the person who fires the gun knows infallibly that the bullet will choose to do that of its own libertarian free will, and could have chosen not to fire the gun at all, but chooses to fire it knowing full well that bullet will freely choose to kill, to murder its target. And it does seem to me as if, to anybody except erudite philosophers in an ivory tower, both people are responsible for that action, for the resulting death. Now, I grant that there is a distinction that means something in the erudite tower of philosophy, but I don't see any reason to find that a compelling distinction. But you go ahead and tell me why you feel otherwise, and then we can move on.
Yeah, I've written a couple articles on my website about this. The first one, I mean, it was this was several years ago. It was, yeah, not a lot of people were paying attention to what I was saying back then, and and still not a ton of people are today. But it's increased a little bit. But I was very surprised after I published it that Greg Welty himself wrote a response to it, and I was like, wow, that was cool. But then I wrote a response to rejoinder to his response. And I think, so my second article, I think, is much better if anybody wants to take a look at that. And I think it really does show some important differences. But yeah, ultimately on the Calvinistic deterministic view, and by the way, not all Calvinists are determinists, but, or at least exhaustive determinists, another reason I use the term. But on the determinist view, the one who fires the bullet, well, if God fires the bullet here, since he sets up the whole thing, he's the necessary and sufficient condition. On the Molinist view, he's only the necessary condition. And I think we can see, so the argument is on the bullet bill thing, that people have this intuition that both are guilty. But I think that intuition has been I think it was destroyed in 2019 when the Avengers Endgame came out. Now, Chris, I got to say, I love the fact that you always bring up Lord of the Rings and everything like that. And if you do that, I'm not going to say, but Gandalf isn't in the Bible.
Well, I don't like the people who criticize you for using Avengers analogies. I mean, Jesus used parables. Why wouldn't we likewise use analogies? So, yeah, but of course, there is the question as to whether the analogies are apt. Like your Bucky analogy, I think is BS, but that's a whole nother conversation. Well, so we can.
Well, okay, I mean, okay, I'll just, so both, Hydra predestined Bucky via causal determinism, even though Bucky had awareness, he was a passive passenger at that point. But
it wasn't his own mechanism, though. It was imposed from without.
Right, and God imposes from without. A deity of deception imposes from without. He gives, if he determines everything, if he uses his power to determine how Bucky is going to think, and Hydra wasn't in the mix. If we're just going to say, well, that was his God-given nature, well, then Hitler did exactly what he was supposed to do. And it would have been good if a demon would have possessed him and made him love the Jews instead of kill him. So the point here isn't who's doing it. It's the fact that if antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate, or if they're not, and if there's a different way to predestinate. So Dr. Strange predestined all the evil of Thanos without causally determining him, and to do so, and yet millions upon millions and millions of people saw him as the hero, while everybody knew that causal deterministic mind control is evil. What would you say?
Okay, well, but let's talk about that. Are you, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that that Dr. Strange is praiseworthy for actualizing the world that results in victory over Thanos. Is that right?
Millions and millions of people thought so.
Okay. Wouldn't it be true then that if instead he had chosen to actualize a world in which Thanos is ultimately victorious, that he would have been blameworthy?
Say that again?
So if I understood you correctly, you said that Dr. Strange is morally praiseworthy for actualizing the feasible world that resulted in Thanos' defeat. And you said yes, I think.
And ultimately, I'm saying he's not blameworthy for all the evil that happened in Endgame.
Well, I know, but if he's praiseworthy for actualizing the world that results in Thanos' defeat, then if instead he had chosen to actualize a world that results in Thanos' victory, why wouldn't he be blameworthy if he's praiseworthy for what he does in the actual world?
All right, so okay, so this is going to get us into several things: feasibility and the end game. Since we're talking about end game, so much of Infinity War and Endgame really is taken from Scripture. There's so many parallels here, but
I think just as a side note, I think the reason why that is because a lot of people involved in the production of comic books, very early on, were Jews with a familiarity with the Old Testament. I mean, the names of like Kal-El in Superman, the names of the creatures that are in the other universe or whatever that he comes from, those are names that are very Hebraic. I mean, it's just interesting to me that many people from Judeo-Christian backgrounds are responsible for comic book universes in which feature these kinds of concepts. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry.
Well, gosh, now you need to have Chris and I on here just to nerd out sometime to talk about this. Because this is where we're all going to agree.
Will happen, man. I can do that for you guys. We're actually in a couple of weeks talking about, is ghost hunting a sin? You know, all those ghost shows that are coming out. We're just going to nerd out and talk about if that's an actual sin. And we're going to probably put some stuff up on there. So you guys are welcome to come on and nerd out with us a little bit.
Can a Christian be a Ghostbuster, I guess?
So anyway, Tim, you were talking about Endgame, and you were answering my question about whether... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've actually got another journal article coming out in early 23 where really, so I'm taking a Molinist approach to defeating, ultimately, I think, all the problems of evil, and comparing and contrasting it to where I don't think the Calvinist has the same tools in his toolbox, or the open theist, or the simple foreknowledge person, where I'm going to argue that Molinism is really the only way to solve all the problems of evil, and really specifically focused on problems of divine hiddenness. But but we do that by saying, okay, what's important to God? He wants free creatures, and argue that he wants the kind of love that is not necessitated by antecedent conditions, right? He wants a kind of love where we can accept it, or where, as long as we don't, because I'm a monergist, that might be another topic, but as long as we don't reject God's flirtatious advances and his love, offers of love, then we will eventually find ourselves in a true love relationship, which I then argue is the essence of salvation. But then, so with that in mind, you got to have libertarian freedom. And then with the end game in mind, what is important to God is the end game, with eternity in mind, with eschatology in mind. And so
okay,
the same thing was true with Dr. Strange there. He was looking at the end game. That's why they called it that. And he saw, there was a lot of bad stuff that led up to the best of all feasible worlds for Dr. Strange, including some really bad things. But with the end game, with eternity in mind, it was the best, and ultimately all the saints were raised. So what do you think? Okay.
No, so I'm glad you put it that way. So if I can make sure that I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that although Dr. Strange did not, in some sense in the word, want all of the wicked things to happen that eventuated in the end game that he did want, the fact that he wanted that end game meant that he was willing to actualize these actions, these wicked actions, because of the end game that he really ultimately wanted. Is that fair?
Yeah, the end game with libertarian free creatures in mind.
Okay, so but the point is, Dr. Strange in the analogy has an end game in mind that is only possible if he actualizes a world in which things that he otherwise wouldn't want to happen do. Fair?
I believe that's fair.
Okay. Well, I think we Calvinists think in you're right, some Calvinists claim not to be determinists or vice versa, whatever. So we determinists also think, or at least can think, as I do, that the reason why God foreordains, predetermines all the evil in the world is with an end game in mind that is only possible in the event that those things that he foreordains to take place do in fact take place. So, for example, and I'm sure that there are flaws in this, and it'll be interesting to talk about them if we get to them. But Eric Hernandez says this has turned into a strange conversation. I do see what you did there, Eric. So hypothetical. So here, for example, is something that I've had a conviction of for some time. I think that that God desires that we, his creatures, experience the opportunity to emulate God in ways that would not be possible were it not for the realities of sin and evil and pain and so on and so forth. So, for example, if it hadn't been for somebody's need, if it weren't for the fact that somebody needs something, I would never have the opportunity to show mercy, to show hospitality. If it weren't for somebody sinning against me, I would never have the opportunity to exercise forgiveness. And on it goes. The point being, I think, my conviction seems to me to be that, yes, God predetermines all the evil that takes place in the world, but it's with an end game in mind, which is our ability as his viceroys, as people who bear his divine image, to have the ability to act like God and exercise these qualities of forgiveness and mercy and so forth, which wouldn't have been possible had it not been for what we see in the world. So help me to understand, apart from just the bare claim of libertarianism, what is the distinction that has a difference between Dr. Strange actualizing a world in which stuff happens that he wouldn't, that he doesn't want to happen, in order to bring about an end game that he does? What's the difference between that and me saying God determines everything in the world to happen in the way that it does, with an end game in mind that he ultimately desires even more than the determination of all these things that happens in time?
All right. Okay. Let me see if I can remember everything you said there. First, I just want to say I agree with you, and I think it's really good that we're both focusing on the end game. And so if there is no eschatology, pain, evil, and suffering it's meaningless. It just seems meaningless, right? So praise God that we both agree there's purpose involved here. And I think Paul, the verse that's had such an impact on me, and there's several places in Scripture that communicate the same thing, but I love how Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:17 that these light momentary afflictions, and he's got a whole list of all of his afflictions that, Paul writes out a whole list of all of the pain, evil, and suffering that he goes through. But he says all these afflictions prepare us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. So he's focusing on eternity and what is this affliction going to do for us in the end, with the end game in mind. So part of that, I've got a video on my YouTube channel. I think it's called "Can We Sin in Heaven" or something like that. And I talk about this, and I do say, well, look, for God desires the best kind of love. And I argue that the best kind of love can't be determined by something or someone else. So yeah, God has, I think that God is omnibenevolent. That means perfectly good and loving. And so within that, although he necessarily loves, nothing or somebody else is not determining him to love. And so God has to create us. If he determines us that way, then that can't be the best kind of love. So he has to not determine us to love, but give us the option to love. And that requires libertarian freedom. So with the libertarian freedom in mind, God finds the best, I don't like that language. God knows the best. I don't want to say he finds or looks or sees it. Unlike Dr. Strange, that's where the analogy breaks down. But God knows the best end game with libertarian free creatures. And I actually argue, in fact, if I would be speaking at the Rethinking Hell conference this next week,
maybe next year.
Maybe next year, I'd be talking about why, although I reject universalism and I argue against it, I keep it on the table as a Molinist, because, and this will be discussed in the paper that's coming out in 23. I show how universalism makes the best sense on Molinism. And in fact, Kirk McGregor's new book, he's discussing the same thing that's about to come out. But so I'm a hopeful universalist. And so I say basically something like this, that for all we know, God created the one feasible, freedom-permitting world in which evil is ultimately defeated, where true love exists, and where everybody who is not trans world damned, and I put that in brackets, is saved. That not transworld damned in brackets makes room for universalism. But anyway, did I answer your question, Chris? If I didn't, rephrase it.
Well, I don't think so, but that's probably every bit as much my fault as it is yours. It sounded like what you gave is another argument, which is great. I mean, that's what we're doing, is we're arguing, hopefully in an increasingly friendly and brotherly way. But what I didn't hear was an answer to the question, which was, if Dr. Strange is willing to actualize a world in which stuff takes place that he doesn't want to happen as much as he wants to happen the end game, and therefore actualizes that one because of the end game that results in, then I struggle to understand why I, as a determinist, can't likewise say that God predetermines everything that takes place in time with that end game in mind. See, just to flesh this out a little bit more, and then give you a chance to pick up on it. My contention is that want is not a bit. It's not a binary. It's not a 0 or a 1. Want is a term that has a spectrum from want very little to want a whole lot. And the analogy that I've often given, which we can get into if we want, but it was something I unpacked more in the previous conversation I had on the show, is the analogy of an author and the world of the story that the author writes.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah, me too. And I just talked to Braxton on the phone yesterday. I think he told me that when he told you about that, or when you watched the episode in which he and I discussed it, you were like, oh, that's perfect with Molinism. And yeah, that'd be an interesting conversation to have. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, if you talk to authors of like fiction stories, if I'm not mistaken, many of them will tell you they get deeply emotionally invested in the protagonists in their story. They love them. They want what's best for them, but they are also telling a story with an end game that necessitates that they subject the protagonist in their story to evils, to things that they don't want to happen, but are necessary in order to bring about the end game that the author has in mind. Well, so likewise, so in other words, it's not that the author wants, full stop, those evils to happen to the protagonist. I'm thinking, for example, well, never mind. I'm not going to give that example. I was going to use Braveheart, but Braveheart's loosely based on historical events, and that defeats the analogy. But the point is, if it's not that the author wants these evils to befall his or her protagonist in full stop, it's that the end game that the author wants requires him or her to subject the protagonist to these things that he or she otherwise wouldn't want to have happen to the protagonist. And so in the same way, my conviction, whether it's legitimate or not, is that God has an end game in mind that necessitates that he subject creation to things that he doesn't want to have happen full stop, but he does want the end game that necessitates them. And I gave some examples. I would never, and you would never have the opportunity to forgive anybody were it not for you being sinned against, I being sinned against, etc. And so I'm just wondering, what is the distinction with the difference between the Dr. Strange choosing to actualize a world that stuff he doesn't want to have happen happens in order to bring about the end game that he does want to have happen? What's the distinction between that and my view, in which God predetermines a world with an end game in mind because and determines that things happen because they're necessary for that end game?
All right. So I think I would say that Dr. Strange or God on Molinism is working with free creatures to get the end game so that he can have true love and all the other goods that come along with libertarian freedom, such as rationality, also making not allow, on that view, God is not determining those who love and follow him to hold a plethora of false theological beliefs. So the charge of a deity of deception cannot be made on that view. So on the Molinistic view, or on the Dr. Strange view, Dr. Strange or God is working with libertarian free creatures to get to the best feasible endgame. On the Calvinistic determinism view, God is working with determinism to get everything to happen exactly the way he wants, from every instance of evil to every false belief to every false theology.
Not in a vacuum. I mean,
I'm talking everything. That's my.
Oh, but remember, because you need, if you're going to respond to my question, you need to make sure you recognize the distinction I'm making between the stuff that he predetermines to happen leading up to the end game and the end game itself. And just because, and so when you say he predetermines everything that he wants to happen, there is there is one sense in which that's true, but the more accurate way to say it would be he predetermines things to happen that he doesn't want to have happen, full stop. But in order to bring about the end game that he does want to have happen, he therefore wants these things to happen. They're not the same kind of want as the end game. That's the point that I'm trying to get.
So that doesn't seem to me like that'd be a problem for an omnipotent God. If God is omnipotent, I don't think many are going to be are going to share the intuition.
God is omnipotent, but he can't make a square circle, right?
Right. This does not seem to be on that level or category.
Well, it does to me. But it does to me, and this is what we've got to have a conversation here. I'm not saying you're not. I'm just saying you and I are talking to each other, not the world in general. And I do think that it's that this is the case because again, it's not logically possible to forgive someone if they haven't sinned against me.
Was it logically possible for all of your false theological beliefs that you currently advance, and mine too, is it logically possible for us to have one less false theological belief?
Sure.
Okay, so then it seems like there's
the whole story.
No, but is it possible for the toddler to not have been raped as long as she was raped, or thing? I mean, the atheists will start throwing horrible evil things, and is it possible for the adultery not to have happened? And I think there's something and also with an omnipotent God in mind, it seems to me that God could have determined us to have within us everything that we would have learned through a libertarianly free environment that leads to the best end game. God could, if he determines everything, determine perfection from the start, determine that nobody sins, and determine that we all have these qualities that we would learn in a libertarian free environment.
No, you can't, because you just used determine with libertarian. Yeah.
Then I misspoke. What'd you say?
No, you said God can determine.
Okay, sorry about that.
Such and such happen through libertarianism.
Misspoke. Okay. God can guarantee. He could predestine.
Okay, predestine. There you go.
No, wait. So, but God could determine. Also, if we're looking at determinism, God could determine you to have all the great qualities without going through pain and suffering.
Oh, I agree with you.
He is omnipotent.
I agree with you, but remember, I didn't suggest that it's qualities that God desires me to have. What I said is that there are actions that I literally, logically cannot take without having been sinned against or without seeing somebody that's in need, right? I logically cannot forgive somebody that has not sinned against me. At least not legitimate forgiveness, right? I could think wrongly that they've hurt me, but, we result in the same problem. I cannot logically act hospitably and mercifully to someone in need unless that person is suffering a need. So to me, it very much is a matter of square circle logical possibilities.
So to me, if that's the case, then that's a great reason for God to create libertarian free creatures who will freely choose to do evil upon each other, but who God also knows would and will learn from it.
Well, I'm not arguing that this line of reasoning I've offered is an argument against Molinism. I'm just saying it seems to me that it's perfectly analogous to the Dr. Strange analogy insofar as God is subordinating lower level wants in the interest of attaining higher level wants. Whether the mechanism of bringing about the greater want and foregoing the lower wants, whether that mechanism is middle knowledge of libertarian free choices that non-existent agents would make in non-existent worlds, but they're feasible, or whether the mechanism is he predetermines it. Either way, it seems to me that God doesn't want some things to happen, but predestines, to use your word, predestines them to happen because he wants something more, even greater. That's all I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
Can I jump in for just a second here and ask a question?
Yeah.
Specifically of Chris's line of argumentation here, because I think I'm following, but because I agree that in order to achieve the end of our own selfless charity toward others in situations in which they're having, let's say, an affliction, and I have the benefit of not being in that affliction, and then using that benefit for their gain, right? And that's that act of selfless exchange. Is that what you're describing here? That's the reason why God would allow for evil that he doesn't in fact desire? Is that because there's that let's say greater unity that can be achieved from somebody who can give selflessly in that way? Is that what you mean?
Well, a couple of things I would push back on. Number one, I wouldn't use the word allow because I can't even understand why Guillaume Bignon, for example, thinks that it makes sense for a determinist to talk about permission. So he does, and he's smarter than I am by light years.
He's smarter than me too.
I was more so
right.
So
I was more so emphasizing. Yeah, I was more so emphasizing the moral capacity that we would have, that let's say negative events can facilitate something that all positive events could not, namely things like forgiveness or self-sacrifice on behalf of somebody else in order to give them the benefit that I could selflessly, like I could retain my own benefit. I do a homeless ministry, for example, on the weekends with my wife, in which I take the money that I've earned that I could use for whatever I elect to. And then I go out and I use some of it in order to benefit other people who have not. Is that the kind of thing that you're saying? Is that without homelessness, I couldn't give that charity and that correlation? Is that what you mean?
I'm saying that were it not for the reality of people that are undergoing suffering, it would not be logically possible for you to show such a person mercy and hospitality.
Okay. Is that, I would then, do you think then that the highest form of love or unity in that way has to be achieved through that overcoming of negativity, or the overcoming of evil?
No, I didn't make the argument that that the God's desire that you and I might be able to show mercy and hospitality in those ways is a means to a greater good than even that. I'm not making that argument. I'm simply saying there is something good, valuable, desirable about you and I as bearers of the divine image acting in ways that God does by his nature, including showing mercy and hospitality and forgiveness. Whatever, if there's an even greater good beyond that, I don't know. I'm just saying that to me is good and desirable enough to justify God for ordaining the reality of sin and suffering so that you and I can logically exercise those faculties.
Okay, so it's not the case that in order to have that higher good, you would need evil. You're saying that this is a justification for the existence of evil, is to say God can have a greater purpose than simply making evil occur, that it actually has a redemptive purpose in us becoming like him.
Well, all of us, except for open theists, use some form of a greater good theodicy, one form or another. And yes, I'm arguing that God foreordains, predetermines the reality of sin and suffering, in part so that it is logically possible for you and me and others to show hospitality, mercy, etc. So yeah, I do think those things need to be there for you and I to show mercy. It's not merely, I'm not merely saying that evil has to exist for me to be the kind of person who is willing to show mercy, etc. I'm saying those things sin must occur, suffering must occur in order for me to show mercy and hospitality and forgiveness. And whether or not, you talked about how greater concepts of love and unity, I don't know where that's going. I'm not talking about a greater good, even beyond the great good of acting.
It's greater than it not occurring. Is it greater than it had not occurred?
Yeah,
that it did occur is greater than not occurring. Okay, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it is.
What'd you say?
I was saying the world in which evil occurs and we can overcome it by being good like God is a better world than one in which evil does not occur, and therefore we can't have those kind of actions or attributes of being merciful, expressing mercy, and actually being merciful in action rather than in concept.
Right.
He's saying that a world in which you can act that out is superior to one in which you never got the opportunity, or it was a logical impossibility to act that out.
Or at least may be greater. I'm not saying that this is the right theodicy. I'm just saying it does seem to me to be one of other plausible greater goods that come about through the predetermination of evil than if you were not to do that. So.
Yeah, that exchange was pretty awesome, guys. I mean, that just helped me with part of my thesis, so I'm going to probably think about that and add that in. But Tim, I know you wanted to say something, so I'm going to give you the floor. Yeah. Tim, I know you wanted to respond to that too.
No, that was a great exchange. It got me thinking, because I spent probably around 4 weeks a year in Utah sharing the gospel with Mormons, and to me, that response seems like the Mormon doctrine there. That doesn't mean I'm not saying Mormons believe that God is omniscient. All right, they got that right. They get a lot of things wrong, right? But just because a Mormon believes it doesn't mean it's necessarily false. But the Mormon view is that the fall, the first sin, Adam and Eve's fall, was not a fall down, but a fall up. And so they're like, good job, Adam and Eve, because we could not learn hospitality and mercy and things like that unless you would have fallen. So thank you, Adam and Eve, for sinning and rebelling against God. Now, I think that doesn't jive with me, because
it doesn't jive with me either, and I don't think it's comparable to what I'm saying.
Okay, well, so I feel. Tell me what I got wrong here. I felt like you were saying that we had to have evil, we had to have bad things happen to us so that we could learn good traits like hospitality and mercy and things like that. But if it seems like also on divine determinism, God could have determined perfection from the beginning, determined Adam and Eve not to sin, determined that they have the good traits like mercy and hospitality, even if they never get to express them. But if libertarian freedom is important to God, and I think it is for many reasons, then he's like, okay, well, at least these creatures, these humans, can learn and see how stupid sin is over the course of time, so they never freely choose to do it in heaven or whatever. What would you say to that?
Well, number one, I would say that I agree with you that a libertarian or an indeterminist can use the same exact argument I am for permitting sin, which is not something I can do because I don't believe in permission. I believe in predeterminism. So I agree with you there. But then what I would say is that whereas libertarianism can ground God or can justify God foreordaining the predestining, to use your word, the general reality of evil and suffering, any individual instance of evil and suffering it doesn't have purpose in it. It's just part of the greater good of general evil and the existence of general evil and suffering that enables in general this kind of thing to happen. But in my view, as a determinist, or at least as a theological determinism, every predetermined evil or instance of suffering has divine good purpose in it. And I don't think the same thing could be said about in a libertarian view. So that's number one. Number two, the reason why I don't think that the Mormon example is analogous to what I'm offering is because, if I'm not mistaken, and you may have studied Mormonism more than I have, I've done a fair deal, but to be fair, it has been some number of years since I've done so. It's not merely that people that in Mormon theology we have benefited from the reality of sin and evil that were that were actualized by Adam and Eve. It's not merely that we're benefited by being able to show mercy and hospitality and so forth. It's that Adam and Eve themselves are to be praised for what they did. It was, as you said, a fall up. They were to be praised for their action. But here's the thing. Adam and Eve didn't sin in order to bring about these great things that I'm talking, these greater goods that I'm proposing. They sinned out of their own reasons responsive mechanism that in the act of sinning, their reasons were not good. It's similar to Genesis 42 through 50 or whatever, where on the one hand, God and Joseph's brothers, and please understand, I'm not using this as an argument against Molinism, but in fact, I think you and I could probably agree to a certain extent on the significance of this passage. What I'm saying, though, is that in that act of Joseph selling his brothers into slavery, Joseph's brothers selling Joseph into slavery, the text tells us both God and Joseph's brothers intended that calamity to befall him. Exact same verb, exact same direct object, all of that. But the text says God did it for good, whereas Joseph's brothers did not. Well, so similarly, what I'm proposing is that God, number one, he's not the one sinning. He's predetermining sin, and I think that's a distinction. You may not. That's fine. But number two, he's predetermining the sin for these greater goods, whereas Adam and Eve are sinning without those greater goods in mind. So I just don't think that the situation is comparable. Now, one last, well, actually, no, I'll let you go back now.
All right. So just really quick. So, I mean, it is your position that, because I talked to some even who would say that God determines all sins since Adam and Eve, but they would all, but not Adam and Eve. But then I've talked to others that would say, no, God necessitated the fact that Adam and Eve, and let alone Satan and a third of all the angels, would sin. So is that what position do you take there?
Yeah, that's the London Baptist and Westminster Confession views. Those confessions are sometimes misrepresented by the likes of a mutual friend of ours, Leighton Flowers, who argues that those confessions say that Adam and Eve had libertarian free will, but after the fall they did not. That's not what those confessions say. What those confessions say is that Adam and Eve's will was not constrained by sin at that point. They were not influenced by sin the way that everybody since them have been, to choose what they ended up choosing. They had freedom that was not bound by sin. But those confessions also do say that what they did was predetermined by God. And yes, I absolutely affirm that.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, I think that you're a consistent divine determinist.
Well, thank you.
Because I really pressed my other Calvinist friends who said, oh no, they had libertarian freedom to sin. God didn't determine the fall. But I guess I would, and I don't want to get into debate on the London Baptist. Folks like Richard Mueller and Oliver Crisp have argued that there is definitely room for libertarian freedom there.
Yeah.
And they're Calvinists, they're Reformed Calvinists. Mm-hmm. And so there's debate among people on your side. And of course, when I read it, London Baptist, I'm like, sure sounds pretty close to libertarian freedom, if not libertarian freedom to me, but I'm willing to grant, for the sake of argument, your claim today. But so this is what I want to bring up, the reasons responsiveness thing again. You know, you said that Adam and Eve, let alone Satan and a third of all the demons, they acted according to their reasons responsiveness. But this is the point I want to highlight again. On divine determinism, the way Adam and Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels reasoned was necessitated by prior conditions, namely God. Mm-hmm. So that's really the majority of the 20-minute opener I had was focused on the way we reason. I never deny that we don't respond to reasons, but people reason poorly and reason well all the time. So even when people respond to reasons, that's not enough. You need more than that. So God can give us cognitive, or I would say, I don't think God does this, but a deity of deception could give us cognitive faculties, which will necessarily lead us to false beliefs and false theological beliefs, such that Adam and Eve, Satan, and a third of all the angels had, which led to all the pain, evil, and suffering we have today, and then also determine us to sin and hold false beliefs, false theological beliefs, advance bad theology, like Pastor Jones, who was calling you a heretic, and I had to stand up for you because I'm like, no, Chris Dade is not a heretic, and he's got a good theological view of hell here. But Yeah, I just I don't think saying, well, they've got reasons responsiveness. They responded the way they were supposed to, but yeah, that was determined. So help me out there.
Yeah, so from my very fallible and less educated position, it seems to me that just because a choice is determined does not mean that a person isn't reasoning and choosing the action that they want. And so
I agree.
So the analogy I've often given, as you now know, having watched that episode of my show in which Braxton and I talked about it, take the analogy of Tolkien and Middle Earth, right? And just to be clear, I'm not talking about Tolkien and Middle Earth as they actually are, namely just an author and the fictional story he tells. I'm saying, imagine that. By the way, can you still hear me? Because one of my earbuds keeps going out.
I got you.
Okay, good. All right, cool. So I'll just, evidently one of them died. Oh, well. So imagine that by merely conceiving of the world of Middle Earth and everything that takes place in it, which ultimately he pens in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the Silmarillion, imagine if by conceiving of that world, it actually brings that world into existence and everything that takes place in it. Now, obviously, that world would not be in this world, right? It's not like you can say that at point X in time here, it's point Y in time in Middle Earth, and they're both moving forward. No, the entirety of the timeline of Middle Earth, including if it's an infinite future, is accessible to Tolkien at that moment in our time. So there's that transcendence between our world and the world of Middle Earth. And yes, Tolkien has predetermined everything that takes place in the world of Middle Earth. So, for example, he predetermines by conceiving of the world and everything that takes place in it that Frodo, when he, after his long, arduous trip with Sam to Mount Doom, Samwise, at the mouth of Mount Doom, he gives in, he succumbs to the temptation imposed upon him by the One Ring, and decides, I'm not going to throw the ring into the fire. Now, thankfully, as those of us who are as nerdy as I am know, thankfully, Smeagol or Gollum comes out of nowhere and wrests the ring from his hand and falls into Mount Doom with it. And so thank goodness the end story resulted. But the point is, Frodo was predetermined by Tolkien to succumb to that temptation and refuse to throw the ring into the fire. But in this analogy that I've offered, whereby conceiving of Middle Earth, Tolkien predetermines everything that takes place in it, you can't. There's no basis for saying that Frodo is simply a passive cog in a wheel through which actions are being taken. In this analogy, he is a real human, a real hobbit in a real world with a brain, with a mind. He's deliberating. Yes, he's under certain degrees of influence from the One Ring, just like you and I are under certain influences of sin and so forth. Yes, all of that is true, but there's nothing forcing Frodo's hand. There is no chain of dominoes falling or of neurons firing as the result of mechanistically of stimuli being received in via the senses. There's nothing like that. Yes, there is one and only one antecedent condition that necessitates Frodo's action, and that is the mere fact that Tolkien decreed it to happen. But so what? There's nothing forcing Tolkien's hand. He's not being forced, coerced, manipulated, or anything of the sort. He's not a passive cog. He is genuinely making a decision. And to me, now you may not share that same intuition, but that is the intuition I have. And as a result, it seems to me that likewise, if I sin, even if I'm predetermined to, I can still make that choice freely and be held responsible for it, even if God's decree necessitated that I do it.
Can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, cool. Because I just want to ask this before I lose it. So on your view, awesome. I mean, it's so thoughtful. I mean, and look, by the way, Chris, I know that some have said, well, C.S. Lewis offered the author analogy first. But I got it from Parker
Pensay, I think. What is his name? Parker Pensay? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Parker Case.
Case, that's right. Parker Case.
But that might be true. But I believe that you came up with this independently of him. And I know exactly what that's like because I've offered an argument, the free thinking argument. Everybody's like, oh, C.S. Lewis did that first. I'm like, I didn't know. And then I went and read it. I'm like, oh, yeah, very similar. But whenever you think you have a unique idea, just, it's good to know that C.S. Lewis probably already thought of it. Anyway, here's my question. Prior on your analogy, on the author analogy, prior to writing The Lord of the Rings, were there any truths about what Tolkien's characters would do in various situations that were not decided by Tolkien himself? And I ask that because you use the word conceive of, but I'm wondering if Tolkien really conceived of it, or if of all these things, or if Tolkien determined and decided these truth values of what every character would do. How would you answer that?
Well, number one, it seems to me that in my analogy, where the world of Middle-earth and everything that takes place in it becomes actual because Tolkien conceives of it, there isn't even the logical possibility of undetermined choice, undetermined actions. It's not possible in my analogy. There's no possibility for Tolkien to conceive of a world in which people. Well, okay. I mean, you could alter the analogy, of course, and make it something that would allow for libertarian free will. But in my case, there is no existence apart from what is actually determined and what actually gets created. And this is, I think this kind of plays into one of the objections that we determinists often have to Molinists, is this idea that God can have knowledge, infallible knowledge of what free agents would do when those free agents never exist, those worlds never exist, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So, all right, let me try to rephrase that. So is there any truths about how Frodo or what Frodo would do in various situations that were not decided by Tolkien himself?
No, everything in my analogy, everything that takes place in Middle-earth is what Tolkien decided would happen in Middle-earth.
Okay, so
there are no truth conditions apart from his decisions.
Okay, so it's more than he just conceived of it. He determines all the truth values, and he could have determined otherwise.
Yeah, he could have written a very different story for sure. He could have conceived of a very different world and then penned that history instead of the history of Middle-earth.
So Gollum could have repented, and Frodo could have freely chosen to, or Frodo could have been determined to throw the ring in on his own.
Well, had Tolkien decided otherwise, yes.
Right. So that's my point. That Tolkien, on your analogy with determinism, is not just conceiving of the story, but he is determining every truth value about what every character, how they will act.
Well, that's why the way I put it was, by conceiving of Middle-earth and everything that would take place in it, he determines everything that would take place in it. I'm trying to say that his conception of, before there was such a conception of Middle-earth, none of this existed in my analogy. Yeah. But once he conceived of Middle-earth and everything that takes place in it, the conception of it is what creates that world. Yeah.
Okay, that helps. So, I'm glad this got brought up, because I've been thinking about your analogy for especially the last couple of weeks, just preparing for this, and I do think it's a great. It's very thoughtful and really thought out. And I do, like you said, it's I can just tweak it just a little bit and use it myself. And in fact, I think I will moving forward. I'll give you the credit. But just let me ask you this.
Because I'll be honest, I think you've got a brighter future than I do. So if I get some name dropping from you occasionally, it'll be glorious.
Well, I'll tell you what, Chris, let's both bring each other up. What do you think?
That sounds great. Love
it. So help me get this down, because this is where my intuition is struggling here. How is it that these characters, in which Tolkien is deciding all the truth values to how each character will think and act in the story, how is it that these characters can be said to not be compelled, which I've heard you say before, since Tolkien has made their decisions for them, and he could have just chosen otherwise for them? You say that nothing is forcing Frodo's hand, except for the fact that Tolkien decided the truth value of how Frodo's hand would move. So that's where I'm like, I don't think that doesn't work for me. What am I missing?
Well, but what I'm missing, what I don't understand is what causal activity is taken by a truth value. What I mean is, if Tolkien decides that the truth value of the question, will Frodo succumb to the temptation by the One Ring and refuse to throw it into the fires of Mount Doom, I don't see how deciding that truth value has an effect, causes Frodo to act the way that he does. So I put myself in the shoes of Samwise, let's say. I'm Samwise Gamgee, and I'm pleading with Frodo to throw that ring into the fire. And let's say that I'm like Samwise, I'm Super Sam. So I'm not only Samwise, but I also am able to read Frodo's mind, and I can see how all the various circumstances he's in are influencing his decision-making and everything. Let's just say I have access to all that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not Tolkien, so I'm not outside of time. I wasn't the one who predetermined it, but I do have the ability to see what's going on in Frodo's mind. Well, then if I put myself in those shoes, when I look theoretically at what's going on in Frodo's mind, I'm not seeing strings, proverbially speaking, being pulled. I'm not seeing truth values reaching down into the immanent world from the transcendent one and forcing Frodo to do what he does. I literally cannot identify any event, any action, any cause in time that is resulting in them doing Frodo deciding not to throw that ring in the fire. Yes, he is determined, because Tolkien, outside of Middle-earth, transcending Middle-earth, has decided the truth value. But again, truth values are not things that do anything. So there's nothing at the time that Frodo is throwing that ring into the fire. There's nothing moving his strings or moving his limbs as if a puppeteer. And because I can't identify anything in that, other than the transcendent reality that Tolkien has already decided that that's what will happen, I don't see any reason to think it's analogous to puppets or robots or anything of the sort.
Yeah, I think
because it happened before in the past, whenever God decided to decree and not in the present now.
But before and past aren't really the right words for this, because when we talk about Tolkien predetermining everything that takes place in Middle-earth, he's not doing that before Frodo throws the ring into the fire. He's doing it outside of the time that Frodo is in. Right? There is no before the world of Middle-earth in Middle-earth. And in the same way, I don't think that God exists in time. He created space-time, in my view, anyway.
Right. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, man. I mean, that could lead us to a great discussion. I agree. God created the space-time universe. He also created time that is time began to exist that's not even part of the universe. There's different kinds of time we need to differentiate between here, but that's neither here nor there, at least right now. Well, I'll just say this. On page 4 of Bignon's book, again, he has a footnote, page 8, and he says the conditions that are in view could either be temporally prior or logically prior, which is a completely different thing. Yep. Thus leaving room for things like backwards causation or the possibility of a timeless God causing things to occur in time or our time. But so that's the kind of determinism and necessity that he's discussing here. And like you said, he's way smarter than both of us. So,
well, he is, but he's all what you haven't quoted from, and I think it was just sentences before the previous quote from the book that you read. He says, the way he expresses it is very similar to the way I do. I'm not comfortable spreading the word cause around as if it's peanut butter on a piece of bread. There are different senses of causation, and Bignon says something to the effect of causation is such a quagmire of meaning, and there's so many different conceptions of it and everything, that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to say that God is causing it. But then he concedes, if all we mean by cause is make it necessary that it happen, okay, fine, he causes it. But then again, that is a far different meaning of cause, or a far more minimal, let's say, a meaning of cause than what a puppeteer does to a puppet.
Well, a puppeteer causally determines. I mean, and Bignon in his book says, okay, look, if you're going to say causally determines, that just means determines. So we can use the word cause and still mean that. He does say that causation is a morass, and he quotes Van Inwagen there, but we, the whole first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument deals with causation, and that is something that is not strings. There's nothing. There's literally nothing physical or that could be measured by a scientist or observed by a scientist. There's no strings attached, but we are going to say that God transcends the space-time universe and causes the existence of the universe.
Well, hold on a second. I'm not sure that I'm willing to agree with that. I would agree with you. Yeah, well, hear me out for a second. Let me flesh out what I'm trying to say. I agree with you that at the moment of creation, when the space-time universe leaps into existence, there's nothing in time pulling those strings. Though the time doesn't even exist yet. Creation doesn't exist yet. But once God creates the universe and the Big Bang starts to unfold, at least my reading of the text is that God is, in fact, actively doing things in creation to bring about the existence of the sun, the moon, the earth, creatures, etc. So all of those creative actions in those opening chapters of Genesis are direct, imminent, in-time actions that God is taking. But when we talk about the predeterminate,
that's not my. I would take a different interpretation. But back to you.
That's fine. I'm just saying. I'm not a blind watchmaker theist. I don't think that God. I'm not a deist. I'm not saying you are either. But I'm not a deist. I don't think that God just snapped his fingers and then let everything unfold mechanistically according to the laws of nature. I think God exercised creative activity. Regardless of whether one holds to a young earth, old earth, or theistic evolutionary perspective, I think God is acting in time to bring about the creation of the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, human beings, etc. But the same is true of not our predetermined actions, at least not all of them. Sure, there are some times where God acts in time to bring about a cause. That's what we believe happens in regeneration, for example, those of us who are Calvinists. Or take, for example, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. God causes Pharaoh's heart to become hardened in a way that is different in meaning from the sense of him causing something to happen in the sense merely that he necessitates it. Tipping a domino over is not, in my view anyway, not in my intuition, identical causation to him rendering it necessary that a domino or that I choose to push a domino over. Let's put it that way. So I'm willing to grant that there is a highly technical, philosophical use of the word cause that is relevant in this discussion, and quite frankly, I think that's what Bignon is conceding. But that doesn't mean that it's the identical kind of causation to moving puppet arms via a string.
Okay, I think my point still remains, though, that the Kalam cosmological argument shows that there is no strings or dominoes or anything like that, nothing physical that exists. And so we're just talking about a supernatural, transcendent cause or antecedent conditions that cause and determine and necessitate the beginning of the physical universe.
Are you talking about whether God was determined to create?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is antecedent supernatural conditions, namely God, that necessitated the existence of the universe. And this was not so when you say, look, truth values, what do truth values do? That, I mean, yes, that's a manner of speaking. This is a semantic way to express this. When it comes to Frodo and his choices and his thoughts, those truth values, I say, well, did Tolkien were those truth values about everything that Tolkien or that Frodo would do, were those up to Frodo, or I'm sorry, were those up to Tolkien? And if so, then Tolkien, because Tolkien chose that story, he determined the story. It was up to Tolkien what Frodo did. And we can say, well, it was still up to Frodo. Well, because it was up to and determined by Tolkien, and Tolkien could have determined Frodo, Gollum, Gandalf, Sauron, and Saruman, and everybody else to do differently.
Sure, absolutely could have, and God could have predetermined a different world to exist.
Okay, I just think that, I mean, we'll have different intuitions, but I think that's the problem when it comes to evil and things like that. And ultimately, as I was trying to really hammer home in my opening speech, I think the worst problem is epistemic evil and what that does for the reliability of Scripture. If we're going to say that God, God determines all of his followers and those who love him to hold false beliefs about him, I mean, we can bring in the tag. I don't bring in the transcendental argument. I'm not a presuppositionalist, but I think they get some things right. Shout out to Eli Ayala. But with the presuppositionalist, you have to what they're trying to show is that there's got to be some things, some starting points that we presuppose. And I'm just going to say one thing you cannot presuppose is that God determines all of his loyal followers, every Christian, every theologian, that God determines all of them to hold false beliefs about God. Because if that's the case, the whole thing blows up. Well, if God determines, necessitates every one of his followers to hold false theological beliefs, the next question is, how do I know which beliefs that I believe are justified but are actually false, determined by God, are true and which are false? And now you don't stand, as I explained in my opening speech, now you don't stand in a position, because that's like saying, wondering if CNN is trustworthy, and you get fact checkers saying that CNN is the most trusted name in news, but then you find out that the fact checkers work for CNN.
Yeah,
boom, it all blows up.
This CNN didn't become incarnate and die for me, so I'm not really persuaded by that argument.
But see, that's a theological belief.
Yeah,
so, and if God determines you to have, listen, here's the problem.
No, I get the problem. All right. Your intuition, and I think that's all it is, you think otherwise, is that if your deliberation process is determined, then the results of that deliberation process aren't your own. But
that's not how I'd say it.
Okay, but either way, my point is, whatever your intuitions are, if I've failed in the 18 times I've heard you express those intuitions, fine, but whatever those intuitions are, I don't share them. There's nothing in me that thinks that somehow my deliberation process is an illusion if that deliberation process is ultimately determined. What's that?
I'm not saying that, though. That's not my argument.
Okay, fine. Go ahead and lay it out again, and maybe the 19th time I'll get it.
Are you guys at the point where you're agreeing to disagree?
Yeah. Listen, what I was trying to get to was simply that I actually think that there's good reason why God would determine his people to have false theological beliefs. And that is exactly the kind of thing that we are doing here. I have been saying for some time, Braxton and I have talked about this on the phone, I think there is something beautiful, desirable, valuable, and good about his people recognizing that they have different beliefs on these topics, but instead of being a-holes to each other about it, as Tim and I sometimes do because we're human, but instead of doing that, we
great.
we press into our love for one another and our love for God, and we dive deeply into Scripture to try to make sense. And by the way, we use our God-given faculty of reasoning to try and understand. Use philosophy as theology's handmaiden to make sense of what Scripture says. I think it's a good thing that we are able to disagree and press into God's word to try to make sense of things on topics about which we disagree. So once again, I think there actually is a plausible greater good that would justify God predetermining his people to hold false theological beliefs.
All right. Well, are you guys, I know you guys have been going we've been here 2.5 hours too.
You guys have just been audience members.
We have. You guys have done so good. we don't need to moderate. I mean, you guys know what you're talking about. We don't need to jump in. We just let you guys go, and you guys have been great. And I just want to know, are you guys at the point where you want to take questions from the audience? Where are you guys at right now? You guys can keep discussing this. I'll keep being an audience member. I'm learning. So, I mean, I love this. I could keep going, but it's up to you guys.
I probably, I was hoping to take my wife on a date after my discussion with Chris State tonight. We were going to go see, we were going to go see Black Adam tonight. I guess that's going to have to be moved to tomorrow. But,
man, I want to see that. You tell me what you think of that when you do go see it.
I sure will. I promise you. I probably don't want to stick around too much longer, so probably don't want to do audience questions tonight, but maybe we can come back and do some more of that at some other point, whether Chris and I are together or solo or whatever.
Well, can you do at least a few? It's up to you.
I gotta pee really bad, so
we'll respect your wishes. Tyler, I'll give it to you.
Go ahead, Tim. He's going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to just say one more thing about what Chris was saying there, and I think there's a difference between God saying that it. I think what you said it twice. I think one time if you would go back, you wouldn't use that word, but you said it's good that God allows false beliefs, and then the second time you said He determines false beliefs.
Well, I meant determines.
Yeah, I know you did. So here's my problem though, and I'm not saying that we don't deliberate, but the whole point of my 20-minute opener was how we deliberate. So yes, humans deliberate on determinism, or let me say it this way, and I know Chris will have a different intuition and disagree with me, but I will argue that humans experience passively sensations of deliberation as opposed to the active language of we deliberate. But I know we're going to disagree on that, and we'll probably have to agree to disagree on that. But here's my argument. If God determines everything, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then we have reason to doubt every theological belief we've said tonight, including, well, maybe God's got good reasons to determine evil. I mean, the whole thing blows up. But then the next premise is this: God is not deceptive, and His word can be trusted. We can have assurance of salvation. Can I get an amen? Right? So then we got two deductive conclusions. The fourth step, conclusion, step number 4. Therefore, God does not determine all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And 5, therefore, God does not determine all things. So my argument is not against that we don't experience deliberations, that we don't have reasons, responsiveness, and all that kind of stuff. I'm saying at the end of the day, if God determines all things, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And as I said in my opening, even if God has morally sufficient reasons, even if there's all kinds of goods that can come from determining us to hold false beliefs about God and Christian doctrine, even if God has good and morally sufficient reasons to be a deity of deception, I still say He's still a deity of deception, even if it's for morally sufficient reasons. And that puts us in an epistemic loss when it comes to debates like this, because we can't trust our reasoning. And we say it's God-given reasoning, but He's making some of us reason poorly. And that's the problem I'm trying to expose. What do you think?
Well, I just don't think it holds any water. I think it's simply a bald assertion, and that is all it is, that if a choice is determined, then one is nothing but a passive cog.
Yeah, but that wasn't an argument I just gave. That wasn't.
Actually, it was. That was the argument you gave, and then you said that the point I'm trying to make here is about God being trustworthy. And what I'm saying is, number one, to the first point, I don't share your intuition that somebody whose choices are determined is just a passive cog in a machine. But to the question you were asking, or the point you were making, the argument you were making, that the whole thing blows up, quote unquote, if God has predetermined false beliefs, I don't share that intuition. It seems to me that so first of all, for example, as Colton Carlson pointed out in his discussion with one of his discussions with Tyler Vela, it could be that the very reasons responsive mechanism that we are determined to have is also one that has the resources necessary to distinguish between poor reasoning and good reasoning, or what have you, and be very honest. We're at a point now where it's so far over my head that you're going to have that conversation with Colton Carlson and not me.
Yeah.
But number two, again, God is unlike the way that you tend to characterize and think about determination. I don't see it as simple causation that would in any way mean he is deceiving us. Yes, he is predetermining me to be deceived about something, but it doesn't follow. Necessitating, sure. He is he has rendered things such that it is necessary I be deceived about some things. And my response is, yeah, so what? We all believe he deceives people in some way, shape, or form. The Bible says he has done it so at times. Your response is, yeah, but those aren't Christians. Well, but yeah, we have a fallen nature. So, and what's more is, I've already said, I think that there are plausible reasons why God might predetermine his people to have false theological beliefs so that they can have the kind of loving disagreement we're trying to have right now. So yeah, I mean, I just don't share your intuition. To me, all I hear in the various arguments that you've offered is bald assertion, question begging, bald assertion. And I don't beg the same questions, and I don't make the same bald assertions.
Well, okay. Well, tell me what bald assertion or a question begging was involved in any of my premises of that argument I just gave.
That if one's choice isn't or is determined, then one isn't making a choice. That wasn't in my argument. That was not in my argument.
It was, Chris. I'm asking you to deal with my argument here, and what you just said had nothing to do with it.
Tim, I don't have a photographic memory of every syllogism you've ever offered anyway, or even here.
I'll read it to you. Okay.
It'd be a lot easier if I had it on a screen, but go ahead.
I know, I'm sorry. Premise one, if God determines all things, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, true or false?
True.
Okay. Two, if God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then our theological beliefs have reason to be doubted.
I don't think that's any truer of determinism than in your view.
Just answer the question. Is it true on determinism?
The very loose statement, have reason to doubt, is true, yes.
Okay, that means defeater. A defeater is raised against all of your
No, it's not. Beliefs. Just because you state a premise doesn't mean that premise is precise and accurate enough.
That's what a reason to doubt means. Reason to doubt means a defeater is
finish a goddamn sentence. Okay. So it's fine. I've told you what premise or where I think your argument falls apart. I think your second premise in that argument is woefully ambiguous.
Yeah, and you know it does happen. You guys have gone a long time to where patience can get muddled, but you guys have done great. And and I'm just gonna jump in and just say, guys, this has been great. I mean, man, both of you have got me thinking in so many different ways, and to the point where I'm texting some of my coaches hey, this is awesome. This is look at this point, look at this point, look at this point. You guys have done so well, and your love for each other has shown here. And yeah, you get frustrated. I get frustrated with Tyler. Me and Tyler, even on air, have got frustrated with each other, and it just happens, and you guys have done great, and you guys shown such good character here, and I appreciate it.
I hope so.
No, you guys have. There's
no
doubt.
I feel at times where I let my frustration get the better of me, and so I want to apologize, Chris, when I've done that tonight. If I had hair, there's a few times I would have pulled it out, but I've already done all that. So, but man, I apologize whenever I cross the line, and I just do love you, Chris, and I think you're an awesome theologian, and you are a force to be reckoned with. And where we disagree on this, like I said in my opening, you have shaped important aspects of my theology. And for the theologians that I can say that about, I can fit in the palm of my hand. That's a very short list of names. And you are one of those guys, Chris. If people aren't following Chris State, they're making a huge mistake. And I love you and look up to you and want to just encourage you to keep pressing into me, disagreeing with me, and sharpening me like iron. I love you.
I'll echo all those same things. I love you as well, and I think people should be following you and letting you shape their theology as well, influence it. The one thing I'll add, not that you would disagree in any way, is that I've been saying for some time now in closing statements like these that that possibly the truest understanding of soteriology and of foreknowledge and so forth plausibly is not straight down the line Calvinistic theological determinism, or straight down the line Molinism and a middle knowledge and feasible worlds, and maybe it's not straight down the line simple foreknowledge Arminianism or provisionism or et cetera, et cetera. Maybe plausibly the truth is something that no Christian has yet really gotten to. And the only way any of us, I think, are going to get to whatever that truth is if we press into these kinds of conversations. Yes, sometimes frustrate each other and annoy each other, sometimes even hurt each other. But I think that kind of loving and respectful search for truth is the only way that we're going to get to whatever that truth is. And it's been an honor and pleasure to be able to do that with you two.
Yeah, and I just want to say that both of you guys, I'm saying with all my heart, have influenced me. You know, when I first heard Chris, it was on Leighton Flowers' show. I had just started listening to Leighton Flowers, right? And Chris was on there. So let me check this guy, Chris Dade, out, right? And then I started listening to your debate, started listening to things that you've said, and I was like, man, you know, this is really great. And then Tim, I told Tim last time he was with us that, you know, it was just by happen chance that I looked at a reasonable faith thing, and he's talking about like what apologetics did to him, and it's just I was just getting into apologetics, you know. So I mean, you guys have been at the forefront. This is why I call you guys like legends and stuff like this, because you guys have been heavy hitters in my life. And you know, I take what you guys have said, and I've taken what I've learned from you guys, and I take it to my workforce. You know, I take it to the streets. I take it to whoever I talk to, the friends I make and stuff like that. And, you know, part of you guys are in there. And, you know, it's all because we worship and we love the same God.
Amen.
Amen.
You know, and gosh, I mean, it's what he does with us. You know, it's what he does to us. You know, it's that look where I told my friends, like, on Facebook this week, I said, you know, you guys get excited when someone scores a touchdown. Chris, you might get excited when a goal goes off in the, you know.
I actually get more excited when a goaltender makes a really awesome save, because that's what I was when I played.
Yeah, you know, I played a lot of street hockey too, and you know, I love the Caps, so that's just me. But honestly, I mean, I was telling people on Facebook, I said, you know, people get excited when these goals hit and when these touchdowns get scored, but I get excited when Jesus looks at the Pharisees and says, I am. And I was like, you know, that's what really gets me excited.
Yeah.
And with you guys' talk tonight, I mean, I've learned so much, and I'm sure Tyler, I'm going to kick it to him in a minute. He agrees, man. And, you know, thanks guys for coming on, and maybe we can do a part 2, but not a part 2 of the debate, but a part 2 of answering people's questions. Because we got a lot. We did. You guys have got people talking, you know, and that's what we're here for. That's what we're here. We're here to learn and discover the truth together. Tyler, go ahead, man.
No, I think if I say anything else, it'll be just superfluous. So out of respect for Tim and his bladder, I will go ahead and
thank you.
Absolutely. And end this now. So catch us next time on Faith Unaltered. I just want to extend my gratitude to Tim and Chris. Thank you guys for joining us. Hope we can have you back. But until then, God bless, good night, and stay like Christ.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.